You've been lied to about peace. They told you it comes from saying the right thing, from defending yourself, from making people understand your heart. But if that were true, why do so many words leave you feeling drained? Why do so many explanations create more pain instead of peace? Why does speaking so often turn a small moment into a heavy burden? The truth is, peace is not always protected by words. Many times, it is protected by silence, and Buddhist wisdom reveals why silence protects your peace more than words ever will. For centuries, this wisdom has shown that true strength is not found in reacting to every opinion, correcting every misunderstanding, or fighting every battle. It is found in the calm power of restraint, the deep stillness of non-reaction, and the quiet courage to let noise pass without entering your soul. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something will begin to change. The urge to explain will weaken, the need to react will soften, the storm inside your mind will begin to settle. You'll feel a clarity rising within you, like the sky opening after dark clouds. And when you wake up tomorrow, you'll understand that silence is not emptiness. Silence is protection. Silence is strength. Silence is peace. This isn't just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a quiet awakening waiting to happen. Are you ready? Let's begin. But before moving forward, something uncomfortable needs to be seen clearly. Most people don't lose their peace in loud, dramatic moments. They lose it quietly, in conversations that seem small, in explanations that feel necessary, in words that slowly pull them away from themselves. What feels like communication often becomes self-betrayal, and once this is understood, silence is no longer confusing. It becomes obvious. Now something deeper begins to unfold. The violence hidden inside unnecessary explanation does not look like violence at all. There are no raised voices, no visible wounds, no obvious harm. On the surface, it looks polite, mature, even wise. A person is simply trying to explain, trying to be understood, trying to keep things peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, something much heavier is taking place. Every unnecessary explanation is a quiet act of pressure against the self. It is the moment where inner truth begins to bend under the weight of external judgment. Instead of standing firmly in what is known inside, energy is redirected outward, trying to reshape how others see it. That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. Because the moment explanation becomes excessive, it stops being communication and starts becoming negotiation. Not negotiation of facts, but negotiation of identity. Who you are begins to feel like something that must be defended, adjusted, or softened so that others can accept it. And that is where the violence begins. It is not loud, but it is constant. It is the tightening in the chest when words are not received the way they were intended. It is the mental replay of conversations, searching for better phrasing, better tone, better timing. It is the quiet frustration of realizing that no matter how clearly something is explained, it is still misunderstood. Over time, this creates a pattern. The mind begins to anticipate misunderstanding before it even happens. Words are chosen more carefully, not from clarity, but from fear. Sentences become longer, explanations become heavier, and conversations become exhausting. What once felt natural now feels like work. And yet, it continues. Because there is a belief underneath all of this. A belief that if something is explained well enough, peace will follow. That if the right words are found, everything will settle. That if understanding is achieved, the tension will disappear. But that belief is not true. Peace does not come from being understood by everyone. Peace comes from not needing to be understood by those who are not willing to see. This is where unnecessary explanation becomes harmful. It keeps the mind trapped in a loop of effort without resolution. It creates a dependence on external validation, where inner calm is tied to how others respond. And when those responses are unpredictable, inconsistent, or dismissive, peace becomes fragile. Buddhist wisdom speaks deeply about this pattern, not through complex theory, but through simple observation. The suffering is not in the misunderstanding itself. The suffering is in the attachment to being understood. When that attachment is strong, silence feels uncomfortable. It feels like something is left unfinished, like something important has been abandoned. There is an urge to return, to clarify, to complete the conversation. But what is actually unfinished? Not the truth. The truth remains unchanged, whether it is explained or not. What feels unfinished is the desire for agreement, for recognition, for alignment. And when that desire is not met, the mind tries to fix it through more words. This is where the cycle deepens. More explanation leads to more misunderstanding. More misunderstanding leads to more explanation. And slowly, without noticing, peace is replaced by effort. The conversation is no longer about connection. It becomes about control. Not control over others, but control over how one is seen. And that is exhausting. There is a different way to see this. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every perception needs to be changed. Not every thought someone has about you requires a response. This does not mean indifference. It does not mean lack of care. It means clarity about what is yours and what is not. Your intention is yours. Your truth is yours. But how others interpret that truth belongs to them. And when that boundary becomes clear, something shifts. The need to explain begins to loosen, not because communication is no longer valued, but because it is no longer used as a tool for validation. Words become lighter, conversations become simpler, and silence becomes more comfortable. At first, this feels unfamiliar. There is a moment where the old pattern tries to return. A thought appears, saying something should be said, something should be corrected, something should be clarified. The body may even feel a slight tension, as if preparing to speak. But if that moment is observed instead of acted on, something surprising happens. The tension fades, the urgency disappears, and what remains is stillness. That stillness is not emptiness. It is presence without resistance. It is the absence of unnecessary effort. It is the space where peace exists naturally, without needing to be created. This is the real power of silence. Not silence as avoidance, not silence as suppression, but silence as understanding. The understanding that not every situation deserves your energy, that not every thought needs to become a word, that not every misunderstanding requires correction. There is also something else that begins to reveal itself. When unnecessary explanation is removed, authenticity becomes stronger. Words that are spoken come from a place of clarity, not pressure. They are not shaped by fear of misunderstanding, but guided by inner alignment. This changes the quality of communication completely. Instead of trying to convince, there is simply expression. Instead of trying to control outcomes, there is openness. And because there is no attachment to how it is received, there is no emotional weight attached to it. And when words carry no weight, they do not disturb peace. But when words are used to seek approval, to avoid rejection, or to control perception, they carry a heavy emotional charge. That charge does not disappear after the conversation ends. It lingers. It returns in thoughts. It shows up in mood. This is why unnecessary explanation feels draining. It is not the act of speaking that creates exhaustion. It is the intention behind it. When the intention is rooted in fear or attachment, every word carries that energy. And that energy does not stay in the conversation, it follows back into the mind. This is the hidden cost. Time is lost, but more importantly, inner space is lost. The mind becomes crowded with unfinished dialogues, imagined responses, and emotional residue. Even in moments of quiet, there is noise. And that noise is not coming from the outside. It is the echo of words that were never needed. This is why silence protects peace. Not because silence solves everything, but because it prevents unnecessary disturbance. It removes the conditions that create inner noise. It allows the mind to return to its natural state, which is not constant thinking, but quiet awareness. There is also a deeper layer to this. Unnecessary explanation often comes from a fear of being seen incorrectly. There is a desire to maintain a certain image, to be understood in a specific way. But that desire creates tension because it is based on something that cannot be fully controlled. No matter how carefully something is explained, it will still be interpreted through another person's perspective. Their experiences, their beliefs, their emotions all shape how they hear what is said. So even perfect communication cannot guarantee perfect understanding. When this is truly seen, the need to explain begins to dissolve. Because the effort is no longer seen as effective, it is no longer believed that peace can be secured through words. And once that belief fades, a different approach naturally emerges. Instead of trying to control how others see you, there is a focus on how you see yourself. Instead of trying to correct every misunderstanding, there is acceptance that misunderstanding is part of human interaction. And instead of trying to achieve perfect communication, there is comfort in imperfection. This does not mean becoming silent in every situation. There are moments where speaking is necessary, where clarity is helpful, where expression is meaningful. But those moments are different. They do not come from pressure. They come from presence. They are not driven by fear, they are guided by intention. And because of that, they do not disturb peace. They flow naturally, without resistance, without attachment. That is the difference. Unnecessary explanation comes from insecurity. Necessary expression comes from clarity. One creates noise, the other moves through silence without breaking it. This is the subtle but powerful shift. It is not about speaking less or saying nothing. It is about understanding why something is being said. It is about noticing the impulse before the words are formed. And it is about choosing whether that impulse deserves to become sound. When this awareness is developed, silence becomes a choice, not a reaction. And in that choice, there is freedom. Freedom from needing approval, freedom from needing agreement, freedom from needing to be understood by everyone. And in that freedom, peace is no longer something that has to be protected. It simply remains. And once that becomes clear, something even more uncomfortable begins to surface. If unnecessary explanation was quietly taking energy away, then what sits beneath it is even deeper. It is not just the habit of speaking too much, it is the hidden need that keeps those words coming out, a need so subtle that it often feels like responsibility, like care, like doing the right thing. But when it is seen clearly, it reveals something else. Now something heavier unfolds. There is a form of begging that does not look like weakness. It does not ask for money. It does not sound desperate. It does not appear loud or obvious. It hides inside normal conversations, inside polite sentences, inside the urge to be understood. It sounds like trying to explain one more time. It sounds like correcting how someone sees you. It sounds like adding more words, hoping that this time it will finally land. But beneath all of that, there is a quiet request being made. Please see me differently. Please understand me. Please don't reduce me to this version of me. This is psychological begging, and most people don't even realize they are doing it, because it feels justified. It feels like maturity. It feels like healthy communication. But the deeper truth is, it is driven by a need that cannot be fulfilled externally. The need to be validated, the need to be seen correctly, the need to feel secure in how others perceive you. And once that need takes control, silence becomes almost impossible, because silence feels like loss. It feels like giving up the chance to fix how you are seen, It feels like allowing misunderstanding to exist. It feels like letting go of control. So the mind keeps reaching outward. It keeps forming sentences, building explanations, trying again and again. Not because it is necessary, but because it is afraid of what happens if it stops. But what actually happens when it stops? At first, there is discomfort. A quiet tension appears, a feeling that something is incomplete. The mind starts to create reasons to speak again. It says something should be said, something must be corrected, something is missing. But if that moment is not followed, if the impulse is simply observed, something begins to change. The need starts to weaken, because it was never about the words. It was about the attachment behind the words. Buddhist wisdom points directly to this. Suffering is not created by what others think. It is created by the attachment to changing what others think. When that attachment is strong, every misunderstanding feels like a threat. Every incorrect perception feels like something that must be fixed, and silence feels like surrender. But when that attachment loosens, silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes release. It becomes the end of chasing. It becomes the end of trying to manage every perspective that exists about you. And in that ending, there is something unexpected: relief. Because psychological begging is exhausting. It is not just about the moments of speaking. It is about the mental weight that follows. The replaying of conversations, the analyzing of words, the wondering if something else should have been said. It creates a constant loop. Say something, think about it, adjust it, say something again. And no matter how many times it is repeated, it never feels complete. Because the real need is not being met. External validation cannot fully settle an internal insecurity. So the loop continues. But silence interrupts that loop completely. Not by solving the need, but by exposing it. When there are no more words to hide behind, the underlying feeling becomes visible. The discomfort is no longer covered by action, it is simply there. And that can feel intense at first, because now there is nothing to distract from it. No conversation to fix, no explanation to give, no response to prepare. Just the raw experience of wanting to be understood. But this is where something important happens. When that feeling is allowed without reacting to it, it begins to lose its control. It becomes something that can be observed instead of something that must be acted on. And once it is observed clearly, it starts to change. It becomes lighter, less urgent, less demanding. And slowly, the need to beg for understanding begins to dissolve, not because others suddenly understand you better, but because your peace is no longer dependent on it. This is the real shift. It is not about becoming silent to avoid people. It is about becoming silent because there is nothing left to chase, no need to convince, no need to prove, no need to secure approval. And when that happens, something else begins to grow: self-trust. A quiet, steady sense that your truth does not need constant validation to exist. That who you are is not defined by how accurately others see you. That misunderstanding does not diminish your reality. This kind of self-trust changes everything, because once it is present, the urge to explain begins to feel unnecessary. Not forced, not suppressed, just naturally unnecessary. Words are no longer used to secure identity. They are simply used when needed and left aside when they are not. This creates a different kind of presence, one that is calm, grounded, and unaffected by external noise. And this presence has a subtle effect on others. Without trying, without forcing, it creates a sense of stability. Because there is no desperation in it, no neediness, no pressure, just quiet certainty. And that certainty is felt. Even if it is not fully understood, it is felt. But the most important change is internal. The mind becomes quieter, not because thoughts disappear completely, but because they are no longer driven by the same urgency. There is less need to revisit conversations, less need to correct imagined scenarios, less need to prepare responses for things that have not even happened. The constant mental activity begins to slow down. And in that slowing down, there is space. Space to breathe, space to feel, space to simply be. This is something that cannot be created through effort alone. It comes from letting go of what is unnecessary. And psychological begging is one of the heaviest unnecessary patterns. It keeps the mind active without resolution. It keeps energy moving outward instead of settling inward. And it creates a false belief that peace can be achieved through external alignment. But once silence is embraced, that belief begins to break, because silence shows that peace is not something that needs to be negotiated. It is something that is already there, beneath all the effort. And when the effort stops, even for a moment, that peace becomes visible. This does not mean there will never be moments of speaking. There will still be conversations, still be expressions, still be times where clarity is needed. But those moments will come from a different place, not from the need to be validated, but from the desire to communicate, not from insecurity, but from understanding. And because of that, they will not carry the same weight. They will not create the same mental loops. They will not disturb the same inner stillness, because they are no longer tied to identity. They are simply actions, not attempts to secure worth. This is the quiet transformation that takes place. Not something dramatic, not something visible to everyone, but something deeply significant. The end of psychological begging, the end of chasing understanding, the end of trying to control how you are seen. And in that ending, there is a beginning of a different kind of silence. Not empty, not forced, but full of presence, full of clarity, full of peace that does not depend on anything outside of itself. And once that is experienced, even briefly, it becomes clear. Silence is not something to fear. It is something to return to, again and again, until it becomes natural, until it becomes home. And as that quiet shift settles in, something else begins to reveal itself. When the need to explain fades, when the urge to chase understanding weakens, when silence no longer feels like loss, but relief, a new kind of tension appears, not inside you, but around you. Because the moment you stop responding, something in others begins to react. Now something deeper comes into view. There is a strange discomfort that arises when you choose silence in a world that expects reaction. It does not always show up clearly. Sometimes it looks like confusion, sometimes irritation, sometimes a sudden change in tone. But beneath all of it, there is one simple truth. The ego feels threatened when it cannot get a response. The ego, both yours and others, is built on interaction. It survives through feedback, through acknowledgement, through the constant exchange of energy. It expects a pattern, a familiar loop. Something is said, something is returned. Energy flows back and forth. But when that loop is interrupted, when a response does not come, the ego does not know what to do. It loses its footing. This is why silence can feel so powerful and at the same time so unsettling. Because it breaks expectation. Most people are not prepared for that break. They are used to conversations unfolding in predictable ways. They expect reactions that match their tone, their energy, their intention. Even conflict follows a pattern. One person pushes, the other pushes back. One person argues, the other defends. It is a rhythm, and when you step out of that rhythm, the entire structure becomes unstable. This is where the ego begins to react. Not necessarily with awareness, but with instinct. It may push harder, trying to pull you back into the loop. It may repeat itself, increasing intensity, hoping to trigger a response. It may even become more emotional, more provocative, more demanding, not because the situation itself requires it, but because the ego is searching for balance. It is trying to restore what feels normal, but silence does not give it that. Silence holds the break, and that break creates space. Space that feels uncomfortable to the ego. Because in that space there is no control, there is no confirmation, there is no reflection of itself coming back. And without that reflection, the ego begins to feel uncertain. This uncertainty is what creates the feeling of threat. It is not that silence is harmful. It is that silence removes the structure the ego relies on. Without response, there is nothing to push against. Without engagement, there is nothing to hold on to. Without reaction, there is nothing to validate. And this applies not only to others, but also to your own ego. Because the ego within also expects response. It expects you to defend yourself when misunderstood. It expects you to correct when misjudged. It expects you to protect your image, your identity, your position. And when you choose not to respond, that inner voice can become loud. It may say something is wrong. It may create a sense of urgency. It may convince you that silence is weakness, that something important is being lost. But if that voice is observed carefully, it reveals its nature. It is not speaking from truth. It is speaking from habit. A habit formed through years of conditioning, where response was seen as strength and silence was seen as surrender. But this conditioning is not absolute. It can be seen, and once it is seen, it can be questioned. Is every response necessary? Is every reaction required? Is every moment of silence a loss? When these questions are allowed to exist without immediate answers, something begins to loosen. The automatic nature of reaction starts to break. There is a pause, and in that pause, there is choice. This is where the real shift begins, because without awareness, response is automatic. It happens before there is even time to think. But with awareness, response becomes optional. It becomes something that can be observed before it is acted on. And when it is observed, it often loses its urgency. The need to respond begins to feel less intense, not because the situation has changed, but because the internal relationship to it has changed. This is where silence becomes powerful, not as a strategy, not as a tactic, but as a natural outcome of understanding. When there is no need to defend, no need to prove, no need to control perception, response simply does not arise in the same way. It is not suppressed. It is not held back. It just does not form. And this absence of reaction creates something new, a kind of stability that is not dependent on external conditions. Because the moment you are not pulled into every interaction, your inner state becomes less influenced by what happens around you. This is what makes silence protective. It creates a boundary without effort. Not a wall that blocks others, but a space that is not easily disturbed. And this space changes how everything is experienced. Words that once triggered reaction now pass through without impact. Situations that once demanded engagement now feel optional. The need to be involved in everything begins to fade. And in that fading, there is freedom. But this freedom can feel unfamiliar at first because it goes against what has been learned. There is often a belief that engagement equals strength, that speaking up is always the right choice, that silence is passive. But these beliefs are not absolute. They are shaped by context, by culture, by experience. And when they are examined closely, they begin to lose their certainty. There are moments where speaking is necessary. There are moments where clarity is important. But there are also many moments where silence is the wiser choice. Not because it avoids the situation, but because it sees beyond it. It recognizes when engagement would not lead to understanding. It understands when response would only create more noise, and it chooses stillness instead. This choice is not always easy because the ego resists it. It wants to stay active, it wants to stay involved, it wants to maintain control. But the more silence is practiced, the more this resistance begins to weaken. The ego starts to realize that it does not need to react to everything, that its identity is not dependent on constant engagement, that it can exist without being validated in every moment. And as this realization deepens, something shifts. The sense of self becomes less tied to external interaction. It becomes more stable, more grounded, more consistent. Not because it is reinforced by others, but because it is no longer seeking reinforcement. This is where silence becomes effortless. It is no longer something that needs to be chosen again and again. It becomes a natural state, a state where response only arises when it is truly needed, and where silence remains when it is not. This changes how others perceive you as well. Not always consciously, but subtly, because when someone is not easily drawn into reaction, they appear different, more steady, more centered, less affected. And this can create a shift in how interactions unfold. Some may respect it, some may feel challenged by it, some may not understand it at all, but none of that changes the internal experience, because the purpose of silence is not to influence others. It is to protect your own peace, and when that purpose is clear, the external response becomes less important. This is the deeper layer of understanding. Silence is not about controlling the situation. It is about stepping out of the need to control it. It is about recognizing that not everything requires your involvement, that not every moment needs your input, that not every interaction deserves your energy. And when this is truly understood, the ego begins to relax. It no longer feels the need to assert itself constantly. It no longer feels threatened by the absence of response. It starts to see that silence is not a loss. It is a release from constant engagement, a release from the pressure to maintain identity through interaction, a release from the endless cycle of reaction. And in that release, there is peace. Not created, not achieved, but uncovered, because it was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the reactions, beneath the need to respond. And when the noise quiets, even for a moment, that peace becomes visible, clear, steady, untouched. And from that place, everything changes. Not the world, not the people, not the situations, but the way they are experienced. And that is where true freedom begins. And when that inner space becomes steady, something even more revealing begins to unfold. It is one thing to notice the ego reacting, and another thing entirely to see what those reactions create over time. What once felt like small responses, harmless words, quick reactions, begins to show a deeper pattern, a chain that quietly follows every moment of engagement. Now something more profound comes into view. Every reaction carries a consequence, not always visible on the outside, not always immediate, but always present within. A reaction is not just a response to what happened. It becomes the seed of what happens next. It sets something in motion, both in the world and inside the mind. This is what Buddhist wisdom calls karma, not as punishment, not as reward, but as continuation. One moment leads into another, one reaction leads into another, one thought gives birth to the next, and without noticing, a simple situation becomes a long chain of mental activity. Someone says something, a reaction arises, words are spoken, or even if they are not, thoughts begin to form. Then those thoughts repeat, they grow, they multiply, and suddenly, what was once a brief moment is now something that follows through the day. This is the karma of reaction. It is not just about what is said externally. It is about what continues internally, because every reaction leaves an imprint. It creates a memory. It creates a feeling. It creates a pattern that the mind can return to again and again. This is why some conversations stay long after they are over. It is not the event itself. It is the reaction that keeps it alive. The mind replays it. It adjusts it. It imagines different outcomes, and in doing so, it keeps the experience active. It keeps the disturbance present. But what if the reaction never happened? What if the moment was seen but not engaged with? then the chain would not form. The experience would arise and then pass, like a sound that appears and fades, like a wave that rises and falls. Without reaction, there is no continuation. This is the freedom of non-participation. It is not about ignoring life. It is about not feeding every moment with unnecessary energy. It is about allowing things to exist without becoming part of them. This changes everything, because once participation becomes optional, the weight of experience begins to decrease. Situations no longer expand beyond their moment. They do not carry forward into the rest of the day. They do not become stories that the mind repeats. They simply arise and then disappear. But this requires a different kind of awareness. The habit of reaction is strong. It has been built over time. The mind is used to responding, used to engaging, used to continuing the chain. So, when non-participation is introduced, it feels unfamiliar. There may be a sense that something is being missed, that something should be done, that silence is incomplete. But if that feeling is observed instead of followed, it begins to change. It reveals itself as a habit, not a necessity. And once it is seen as a habit, it becomes easier to let go. This is where the deeper understanding of karma becomes important. Karma is not something that happens to you. It is something that moves through you. Every reaction strengthens a pattern. Every non-reaction weakens it. And over time, these patterns shape how the mind operates. If reaction is constant, the mind becomes restless, always moving, always responding, always continuing. But if non-participation becomes more common, the mind begins to settle. It becomes less reactive, less dependent on external triggers, more stable in its natural state. This is not something that happens instantly. It develops gradually, moment by moment. Each time there is an opportunity to react, there is also an opportunity to not react. And each time non-participation is chosen, even in a small way, the chain is interrupted. This interruption is powerful because it creates a gap, a space where the mind is not moving, where there is no continuation. And in that space, there is stillness. That stillness is not empty, it is full of clarity. Because without the noise of reaction, things can be seen as they are, not through the filter of emotion, not through the distortion of interpretation, but directly. This changes how situations are understood. Reaction often clouds perception. It adds layers of judgment, assumption, and projection. It turns simple events into complex narratives. But non-participation removes those layers. It allows the moment to remain simple, uncomplicated. And because of that, it passes more easily. There is also something else that becomes clear. Many situations do not actually require involvement. They only feel like they do because of the habit of reaction. When someone speaks, it feels natural to respond. When something happens, it feels natural to engage. But this feeling is not always accurate. It is conditioned. And when that conditioning is questioned, new possibilities appear. It becomes possible to witness without interfering, to observe without reacting, to experience without continuing. This does not create distance from life, it creates clarity within it. Because when there is no constant reacting, patterns begin to show themselves. It becomes easier to notice how certain interactions always lead to the same outcome, how certain conversations always create the same feeling, how certain thoughts always lead to the same mental loops. And with that awareness, choice becomes clearer. Participation is no longer automatic, it becomes intentional. This is where freedom begins to take shape, not as something dramatic, but as something subtle. A freedom from unnecessary continuation, a freedom from carrying moments longer than they need to be carried, a freedom from being pulled into every situation that arises, and this freedom has a direct effect on peace. Peace is not something that needs to be created. It is something that remains when disturbance is not sustained. Reaction sustains disturbance. Non-participation allows it to end. This is why silence becomes so important. It is not just the absence of words, it is the absence of continuation. It is the refusal to extend what does not need to be extended. And in that refusal, there is protection. Protection from unnecessary conflict, protection from mental exhaustion, protection from emotional turbulence. But this protection is not rigid. It is not defensive. It is flexible, responsive when needed, still when not. It does not block life. It allows life to flow without interference. This is the balance, not complete withdrawal, not constant engagement, but a quiet awareness of what deserves participation and what does not. And this awareness grows stronger over time. The more it is practiced, the more natural it becomes. The more the mind experiences the ease of non-participation, the less it feels the need to react. And eventually, something shifts. The default state is no longer reaction, it becomes presence. This presence does not need to do anything. It does not need to respond to everything. It simply remains. And from that place, actions still happen, words are still spoken, engagement still occurs, but it comes from a different source, not from impulse, not from habit, but from clarity. And because of that, it does not create the same chains. It does not leave the same imprints. It does not disturb the same peace. This is the real freedom. Not freedom from life, but freedom within it. A freedom that does not depend on circumstances. A freedom that is not affected by what others say or do, because it is rooted in something deeper, the understanding that not everything requires participation, and that in choosing not to participate, nothing is being lost. What is being preserved is what matters most: energy, clarity, and peace. Once that is understood, even in a small way, it becomes easier to step back, to let things pass, to allow moments to end without extending them. And in that allowing, there is a quiet strength, a strength that does not need to be seen, a strength that does not need to be proven, a strength that simply exists, steady, unmoved, at peace. And as that quiet strength settles, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that is even more subtle, even more personal. Because when reaction slows down and participation becomes a choice, something that was always hidden starts to come into the light. Now, something deeper is uncovered. There is a discomfort that appears the moment silence is chosen, not from the outside, but from within. It is not loud, but it is persistent. A quiet pull, a subtle tension, a feeling that something is being left undone. And that feeling is not random. It is pointing to something that has been there all along. Silence has a way of revealing attachments that were never noticed before. When there is constant speaking, constant reacting, constant engaging, these attachments stay hidden. They blend into normal behavior. They feel like personality, like identity, like who you are. But the moment silence enters, those same patterns begin to stand out. The urge to respond suddenly feels strong. The need to explain feels urgent. The desire to correct, to prove, to be seen in a certain way becomes more visible. And in that visibility, something important is realized. These are not just habits, they are attachments. Attachments to being understood, to being respected, to being liked, to being seen as right, to being seen as good. Attachments to identity, to image, to control over how others perceive you. And these attachments quietly shape behavior in ways that are not always obvious. They create pressure, not from the outside, but from within. Pressure to respond when silence would be more peaceful. Pressure to engage when stepping back would bring clarity. Pressure to maintain a certain image even when it costs inner calm. This pressure often goes unnoticed because it feels normal. It feels like responsibility, like emotional intelligence, like doing what is right. But when silence is introduced, that normality begins to break. The patterns become clear. There is a moment where a response is expected and silence interrupts it. In that interruption, the mind reacts. It begins to create reasons why something should be said. It builds arguments, explanations, justifications, and if that process is observed carefully, it reveals something deeper. The response is not always about the situation. It is about the attachment behind it. An attachment to how the situation affects identity. If someone misunderstands you, the discomfort is not just about the misunderstanding. It is about the attachment to being seen correctly. If someone criticizes you, the reaction is not just about the words, it is about the attachment to being respected. If someone ignores you, the feeling is not just about the silence, it is about the attachment to being acknowledged. These attachments are subtle, they do not always appear clearly, but silence brings them forward. Because without action, without words, without distraction, there is nothing to cover them. They are simply there. And at first, this can feel uncomfortable, because it challenges the way things have always been done. It shows that what felt like natural behavior is often driven by hidden needs. It shows that many actions are not as free as they seem. They are influenced by attachments that operate quietly in the background. But this discomfort is not a problem, it is a doorway, because once these attachments are seen, they can begin to loosen. Not through force, not through rejection, but through understanding. When it becomes clear that the need to be understood is creating tension, that need starts to weaken. When it is seen that the desire to control perception is exhausting, that desire begins to soften. When it is realized that seeking validation creates dependence, the mind begins to let go. This does not happen instantly, it happens gradually. Each time silence is chosen, each time the impulse to react is observed but not followed, the attachment loses a little bit of its strength. And over time, what once felt urgent begins to feel optional. This is where freedom starts to emerge, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. The freedom to not respond immediately. The freedom to not explain everything. The freedom to let others hold their own perceptions without needing to change them. And in that freedom, something else becomes possible. Authenticity. Because when actions are no longer driven by attachment, they become more aligned with what is actually true. Words are no longer shaped by the need to be accepted. They are simply expressions of what is real. Silence is no longer something to avoid. It becomes a natural state. This creates a different relationship with life. Interactions become lighter. Conversations become less charged. Situations that once created tension now pass more easily, because the internal pressure is no longer there. There is no need to manage every perception, no need to control every outcome, no need to hold on to every identity, and without that weight, the mind becomes clearer, more present, more at ease. But this clarity also brings responsibility, because once attachments are seen, it becomes harder to ignore them. There is a choice, to continue reacting as before, or to allow those attachments to dissolve. And that choice is not always easy, because attachments often feel like part of who you are. Letting them go can feel like losing something important. But what is actually lost is not identity. It is the tension that comes with holding on to identity too tightly. It is the constant effort to maintain a certain image. It is the pressure to meet expectations that were never truly yours. And when that pressure is released, what remains is something more stable. A sense of self that is not dependent on external validation. A presence that does not need to be constantly reinforced. A peace that does not fluctuate based on how others respond. This is why silence is so revealing. It does not add anything new. It removes what was covering what is already there. It creates space, and in that space, truth becomes visible. Not the truth about others, but the truth about what is happening inside. The patterns, the needs, the attachments, and once those are seen clearly, they begin to lose their control. Because attachment relies on unconsciousness. It stays strong when it is not noticed. But when it is brought into awareness, it starts to weaken. It can no longer operate in the same way. And this is where transformation happens. Not through effort, not through force, but through seeing. Seeing how attachment shapes behavior, seeing how it creates tension, seeing how it keeps the mind active. And in that seeing, something shifts. The grip loosens, the urgency fades, the need softens, and silence becomes easier, not because it is practiced, but because there is less resistance to it. This changes everything, because when silence is no longer resisted, it becomes a place of rest, a place where the mind can settle, where there is no need to perform, no need to prove, no need to maintain, just presence. And from that presence, life continues. Words are still spoken when needed. Actions are still taken when appropriate. But they come from a different place, not from attachment, but from clarity, not from need, but from choice. And because of that, they do not carry the same weight. They do not create the same disturbance. They do not leave the same residue. This is the deeper purpose of silence, not just to protect peace, but to reveal what disrupts it, to show the hidden forces that shape behavior, to bring awareness to what was previously automatic, and through that awareness, to allow freedom. A freedom that is not dependent on circumstances, a freedom that is not affected by how others think or act, a freedom that comes from within. And once this freedom is felt, even in a small way, it becomes clear. Silence is not empty, it is full of insight, full of understanding, full of the quiet power to see what was always there, and in that seeing, to finally let go. And as those attachments begin to loosen, something unexpected starts to surface. The outside becomes quieter, the reactions become fewer, the need to engage begins to fade. Yet inside, something is still moving. A subtle restlessness remains, a kind of noise that does not come from the world, but from within. Now something deeper must be faced. Silence on the outside is simple. Words can be withheld, reactions can be paused, conversations can be avoided. But silence on the inside is different. It cannot be forced. It cannot be created by effort alone. And this is where many people begin to struggle. Because even when the mouth is quiet, the mind is not. There is a stream of thoughts that continues to move, conversations that replay, responses that were never spoken but keep forming, imagined scenarios, remembered words, anticipated outcomes. It is as if the silence outside creates space, and in that space the inner noise becomes louder. This is the inner noise that makes outer silence difficult. It is not visible to others, but it is deeply felt. It is the reason why silence can feel uncomfortable, even when there is nothing happening externally. It is the reason why sitting quietly can sometimes feel more exhausting than speaking. Because the mind is still active, and this activity is not random. It is driven by patterns. Patterns of thinking that have been built over time. Patterns that were reinforced through constant engagement, constant reaction, constant mental movement. The mind has become used to filling every moment with something. Words, thoughts, analysis, judgment. So when silence is introduced, it does not immediately bring peace. It brings awareness. Awareness of how much is actually happening inside. This can feel overwhelming at first, because the noise was always there, but it was hidden by activity. Conversations, distractions, interactions kept the attention outward. But when those are reduced, the attention turns inward. And what is found is not always calm. It is often clutter. Thoughts moving without direction. Emotions rising without clear cause. Memories appearing without invitation. It can feel like the mind is trying to maintain control by staying busy. This is where understanding becomes important. The inner noise is not a problem, it is a reflection. a reflection of everything that has been accumulated, everything that has been processed, everything that has been carried without being fully seen. When the mind has been trained to react, it continues reacting even when there is nothing to respond to. It creates its own content. It builds its own loops. It keeps itself occupied. And this is why outer silence alone is not enough. Because if the inner noise remains, silence becomes uncomfortable. It feels like something is missing. It feels like something needs to be filled. And this often leads back to speaking, back to engaging, back to creating noise externally just to escape the noise internally. But there is another way to approach this, not by trying to stop the thoughts, not by forcing the mind to be quiet, but by understanding the nature of the noise. The noise is not the enemy. It is a process of release. When the mind has been constantly active, it does not become still immediately. It goes through a phase where everything that was suppressed, ignored, or carried begins to surface. Thoughts that were pushed aside begin to appear. Feelings that were avoided begin to be felt. And this can create the impression that silence is making things worse. But in reality, it is revealing what was already there. This is a crucial point, because if this is misunderstood, silence may be abandoned. It may seem easier to return to distraction, to conversation, to anything that reduces the awareness of inner noise. But if the process is allowed to continue, something begins to change. The thoughts do not stay at the same intensity. They begin to slow down, not because they are being controlled, but because they are being seen. When a thought is observed without reacting to it, it loses some of its energy. It is no longer fed. It is no longer continued. It is simply noticed. And when this happens repeatedly, the overall activity of the mind begins to decrease. The noise becomes less dense. The gaps between thoughts become wider. And in those gaps, something new appears. Stillness, not forced, not created, but uncovered. This stillness is different from silence that is imposed. It is natural. It does not require effort to maintain. It is simply there when the noise is not being sustained. But reaching this point requires patience, because the mind does not change instantly. It has been conditioned over years. It has developed habits of constant movement. So expecting immediate stillness creates frustration, and frustration itself becomes another form of noise. Instead, there needs to be a different approach, one that allows the mind to settle in its own time, one that does not demand silence, but creates the conditions for it to arise. This is where awareness becomes key. Not awareness that tries to control, but awareness that observes. Watching the thoughts without following them. Noticing the patterns without trying to change them immediately. Allowing everything to be seen without interference. This creates a shift, because the mind begins to recognize that it does not need to react to every thought, that not every idea needs to be explored, that not every feeling needs to be acted on, and with that recognition, the intensity of the noise begins to decrease. There is also another layer to this. The inner noise is often connected to unresolved experiences, things that were not fully processed, moments that were left incomplete, emotions that were not fully felt. These remain in the mind as unfinished patterns, and silence brings them forward, not to create discomfort, but to allow completion. When these experiences are allowed to surface without resistance, they begin to resolve. They lose their hold. They stop repeating in the same way, and the mind becomes lighter. This is why silence can feel healing, not because it removes everything immediately, but because it allows what is hidden to come into awareness. And through awareness, transformation becomes possible. But this process requires trust. Trust that the noise will not last forever. Trust that the mind knows how to settle. Trust that stillness is not something that needs to be forced. Because the moment there is an attempt to force silence, the mind reacts. It creates more tension, more resistance, more noise. But when there is acceptance, when the noise is allowed without judgment, it begins to change naturally. This is the paradox. Trying to be quiet creates more noise, allowing the noise creates quiet. And this understanding changes the relationship with silence. It is no longer something to achieve. It becomes something to allow, something that emerges when the conditions are right. And those conditions are created through awareness, patience, and non-resistance. As this becomes more familiar, the discomfort of silence begins to fade. What once felt empty now feels full. What once felt restless now feels calm. What once felt difficult now feels natural. And with this shift, silence becomes a place of rest. Not a space that needs to be filled, but a space that offers relief. A place where the mind can settle without effort. Where thoughts can pass without creating disturbance. Where presence becomes more stable. This stability has a deep impact on everything else. Because when the inner noise decreases, external situations lose their power to disturb. Words from others do not create the same reaction. Events do not carry the same weight. Because there is less internal movement to amplify them, the mind becomes less reactive, not because it is suppressing responses, but because it is no longer driven by the same patterns. And in that state, silence is no longer difficult. It becomes natural, effortless, a default state rather than a forced choice. This is the deeper purpose of understanding inner noise, not to eliminate it completely, but to see it clearly, to understand its nature, to allow it to move without being controlled by it, and through that understanding to experience a different kind of silence, one that is not just external, but internal, one that is not temporary, but stable, one that does not depend on circumstances, but remains regardless of what is happening outside. And once this is experienced, even briefly, it changes the way silence is seen. It is no longer something to struggle with. It becomes something to return to. A place where peace is not created, but revealed. A place where the mind does not need to do anything. A place where everything can simply be as it is. And in that being, there is a quiet, steady, unshakable calm. And as that inner quiet becomes more familiar, another illusion begins to fall away. The mind is no longer as crowded, the noise is no longer as constant, and in that space, something subtle starts to be questioned. The need to speak, the need to express every thought, the need to put every truth into words. It no longer feels as automatic as before. Now something deeper must be understood. There is a belief that truth must always be spoken to be valid, that if something is real, it must be expressed. That silence somehow weakens it, hides it, or makes it less important. This belief feels natural because it has been repeated so often. Speak your truth. Say what you feel. Don't hold things in. But there is another side to this that is rarely seen. Not every truth needs to be spoken to be real. Truth does not gain its existence from being heard. It does not become stronger because it is expressed. It does not depend on acknowledgement to remain valid. It exists on its own, independent of whether it is shared or not. This changes the relationship with speaking, because when it is believed that every truth must be spoken, there is pressure, a constant need to express, to clarify, to make sure everything inside is reflected outside. And this pressure can quietly disturb peace. There is a moment when a realization arises inside, a clear understanding, a feeling, a perspective, and almost immediately, the mind looks for a way to express it. It searches for the right words, the right timing, the right audience. But that movement outward is not always necessary. Sometimes it is driven by the need to be recognized. Sometimes it is driven by the desire to be validated. Sometimes it is driven by discomfort with holding something quietly. And this is where speaking can become excessive. Not because the truth is wrong, but because the expression is unnecessary. There are truths that are meant to be lived, not spoken, truths that deepen through silence, not through explanation, truths that remain clear without needing to be shared. When these are expressed too quickly, something is lost. The depth becomes diluted. The clarity becomes shaped by how it is received. The experience becomes external instead of internal. This does not mean that speaking is wrong. It means that speaking without awareness can create disturbance, because words have an effect. They create reactions. They invite interpretation. They open the door for response. And once that door is open, the simplicity of the original truth can become complicated. This is why silence can be protective. It allows truth to remain undisturbed. It gives it space to exist without interference. It prevents it from being pulled into unnecessary interaction. There is also another layer to this. Not everyone is ready to receive every truth. This is not about judgment. It is about understanding. People hear things through their own perspective, through their own experiences, beliefs, and emotional states. So even when something is true, it may not be understood in the same way. It may be misinterpreted, it may be rejected, it may create conflict. And when that happens, the truth itself has not changed, but the experience around it has. This can create frustration, because there is a feeling that something important was shared, but it was not received as intended. And this can lead to more speaking, more explaining, more effort to make it clear. But in many cases, this only adds more noise, because the issue is not the clarity of the words, it is the readiness of the listener, and this cannot be controlled. This is where silence becomes wise, not as avoidance, but as understanding. Understanding that truth does not need to be forced into every situation, that it does not need to be proven, that it does not need to be defended. It can simply exist. And when the right moment comes, when the right conditions are present, it can be expressed naturally, without pressure, without urgency, without attachment. This creates a different kind of communication, one that is not driven by the need to express everything, but guided by awareness of what is necessary. This reduces unnecessary conflict, because many conflicts arise not from falsehood, but from timing, from speaking something that is true but not needed in that moment, from expressing something that is valid but not helpful in that context. And when this happens, the truth becomes part of a problem instead of a source of clarity. But when there is restraint, when there is patience, when there is an understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent, communication becomes more effective. It becomes more aligned, more precise, and because of that, it carries less disturbance. There is also a deeper personal benefit to this. When not every truth is spoken, there is more space to observe, more space to understand, more space to let things settle. This allows insight to deepen, because expression often ends the process of exploration. Once something is said, it feels complete, but when it is held in silence, it continues to evolve. It becomes clearer, more refined, more stable, and when it is eventually expressed, if it needs to be, it comes from a deeper place. This is why silence can be a form of intelligence, not because it hides truth, but because it protects its development. It allows understanding to grow without interruption. It allows clarity to strengthen without external influence. And this creates a more grounded way of being, one where words are not used impulsively, one where expression is not automatic, one where silence is not feared, but valued. There is also something freeing in this, because when there is no need to express everything, there is less pressure, less urgency, less mental activity around how things should be said. The mind becomes quieter, more at ease, because it is not constantly preparing to speak. It is simply present, and in that presence, there is peace. A peace that does not depend on being heard, a peace that does not require acknowledgement, a peace that exists independently. This does not mean becoming distant or disconnected. It means becoming more intentional, choosing when to speak, not because it is expected, but because it is appropriate. Choosing silence, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying it is not necessary. And this choice creates balance. A balance between expression and stillness, between sharing and holding, between speaking and simply being. This balance is important because without it, communication can become overwhelming. Either too much speaking, which creates noise, or too much silence without understanding, which creates suppression. But when there is awareness, both can exist naturally. Words arise when needed. Silence remains when not. And neither disturbs peace. This is the deeper understanding. Truth does not need constant expression to remain true. It does not need to be repeated, defended, or explained endlessly. It can exist quietly. And in that quiet existence, it remains stable. Unaffected by how others see it. Unaffected by how others respond. Unaffected by whether it is acknowledged or not. And when this is realized, something shifts. The need to prove begins to fade. The need to explain begins to soften. The need to be heard begins to loosen. And what remains is something much simpler. Clarity without pressure. Understanding without urgency. Presence without noise. This is where silence becomes powerful again, not as something that replaces truth, but as something that protects it, not as something that hides, but as something that holds. And in that holding, there is strength, a quiet strength that does not need to be seen, a steady presence that does not need to be confirmed, a deep peace that does not depend on expression. And once this is felt, even for a moment, it becomes clear. Not every truth needs to be spoken, because truth, in its deepest form, does not need words to exist. It simply is. And in allowing it to be, without forcing it into sound, there is a freedom that cannot be taken away. A freedom that comes from knowing that what is real inside does not need to be constantly proven outside. And in that knowing, silence becomes enough, more than enough. It becomes complete. And as that quiet understanding settles, another misunderstanding begins to fall away. Silence is no longer seen as emptiness, no longer mistaken for avoidance, no longer confused with weakness. Yet something still feels unresolved, because many people carry a hidden belief that if you stay silent, you are pulling away, that if you do not respond, you do not care, that if you do not speak, you are closing your heart. Now something more gentle and more powerful begins to reveal itself. There is a kind of silence that does not separate, it softens. A kind of silence that does not reject, it understands. A kind of silence that does not withdraw, it protects both you and the other person at the same time. This is silence as compassion. It is not cold, it is not distant, it is not indifferent, it is deeply aware, because not every moment needs a response to be meaningful. Not every situation needs words to show care, and not every interaction becomes better through speaking. In fact, there are many moments where words would only add more weight, more confusion, more harm. Compassionate silence sees this clearly. It recognizes when speaking would come from emotion instead of clarity. It notices when words would be shaped by frustration, by hurt, by the need to correct or defend. And instead of releasing that energy outward, it allows it to settle. This is not suppression. It is understanding the impact of expression. Because words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. They move into the world, they touch other minds, they create reactions. And when they are spoken from a place of inner disturbance, they often carry that disturbance with them. Silence in those moments becomes an act of care, not just for yourself, but for the other person. Because instead of reacting, instead of adding more noise, you are choosing not to pass on the disturbance. You are choosing not to escalate what could remain small. You are choosing not to turn a temporary emotion into a lasting consequence. This is where silence becomes compassionate. It breaks the chain of reaction. It stops the spread of unnecessary harm. And it creates space. Space where things can settle naturally. There is also another side to this. Sometimes people speak from their own pain, not always clearly, not always kindly, not always in ways that are easy to receive, but beneath their words there is often something deeper: confusion, fear, insecurity, or unresolved hurt. When this is not seen, the natural response is to react, to defend, to respond with equal force. But when it is seen, something changes. There is less urgency to reply, less need to match the tone, less desire to correct immediately. Because the focus shifts from the words to what is behind them. And in that shift, silence becomes understanding, not agreement, not approval, but recognition. Recognition that what is being expressed is not always the full truth of the person, but a moment shaped by their inner state. This allows for patience. It allows for restraint. It allows for a response that is not driven by the surface level of interaction. And sometimes that response is silence. A silence that does not reject the person, but refuses to engage with the disturbance. This creates a different kind of interaction. One that does not feed conflict, one that does not amplify emotion, one that allows space for things to calm down. And in that space, something else becomes possible. Clarity, because when there is no immediate reaction, there is time. Time for emotions to settle. Time for thoughts to become clearer. Time for a more grounded response to emerge, if one is needed at all. This is often misunderstood, because silence is seen as absence, as doing nothing, as not participating. But in reality, compassionate silence is active. It is a choice. A conscious decision not to contribute to confusion, not to add to tension, not to escalate what does not need to grow. It is an awareness of timing, an understanding that not everything needs to be addressed immediately. That some things resolve themselves when they are not forced. And that sometimes the most helpful thing that can be done is to simply not interfere. This kind of silence requires strength. Because it goes against impulse, it goes against the immediate desire to respond, to correct, to express. But it is guided by a deeper awareness, one that sees beyond the moment, one that understands the long-term impact of words and chooses accordingly. There is also compassion toward oneself in this silence, because reacting from a place of disturbance often creates regret. Words are spoken that do not reflect true intention. Actions are taken that do not align with deeper values. And once those words are out, once those actions are done, there is a sense of heaviness, a feeling that something could have been handled differently. Silence prevents this. It creates a pause, a space where emotion can pass before action is taken. And in that pause, there is protection. Protection from saying things that do not need to be said. Protection from acting in ways that do not need to be acted. Protection from creating unnecessary consequences. This is why silence can be deeply compassionate toward the self. It allows for alignment. It gives time for clarity to return. It prevents momentary feelings from shaping lasting outcomes. There is also something else that becomes clear. Not every person needs a response to feel heard. Sometimes what is needed is presence, attention, space. When someone is speaking from a place of emotion, words in return are not always helpful. They can interrupt. They can redirect. They can shift the focus away from what is being expressed, but silence allows for full expression. It allows the other person to speak without interruption, to feel their own words, to hear themselves, and in that process they often find their own clarity. This is a different kind of support, one that does not impose, one that does not guide prematurely, one that trusts the other person's process. And this trust is felt, even without words, because presence has a quality. It communicates in ways that language cannot. It creates a sense of being seen, even in silence. This is why silence does not always mean withdrawal. It can mean deeper engagement. An engagement that is not based on speaking, but on being fully there, fully aware, fully attentive, without the need to fill the space with sound. This kind of silence strengthens connection because it removes the pressure to perform, to say the right thing, to respond perfectly. It allows interaction to be more natural, more honest, more grounded, and this creates a different kind of relationship, one that is not built on constant exchange of words, but on shared presence, shared understanding, shared space. There is also a broader impact of this kind of silence. When one person chooses not to react, not to escalate, not to engage in unnecessary conflict, it affects the entire interaction. The energy changes, the direction shifts, because conflict needs participation, it needs response, it needs continuation. And when that is not given, it begins to dissolve. Not always immediately, not always completely, but the intensity decreases. The momentum slows, and often what seemed important in the moment begins to lose its weight. This is how silence can be a form of compassion toward the situation itself. It prevents unnecessary growth of tension. It allows things to settle naturally. It reduces the spread of emotional disturbance, and it creates the possibility for a more peaceful outcome. This does not mean avoiding all difficult conversations. There are times when speaking is necessary, when clarity is needed, when expression is important. But even in those moments, silence plays a role, because it creates the foundation from which words arise. Words that come from stillness are different from words that come from reaction. They are clearer, more precise, less charged. And because of that, they are more effective. This is the balance, not choosing silence all the time, not choosing speech all the time, but understanding when each is appropriate and allowing both to arise naturally, without force, without fear, without attachment. This understanding deepens over time. As awareness grows, it becomes easier to see when silence is needed, when speaking would add value, when it would not. And this creates a more harmonious way of interacting with the world, one where peace is not constantly disturbed, one where communication is more intentional, one where relationships are less reactive and more grounded. This is the true nature of compassionate silence. It is not withdrawal, it is not distance, it is not lack of care, it is care expressed in a different form. A form that does not always use words, but is felt just as deeply, if not more. And once this is understood, silence is no longer something to explain. It becomes something to embody, a quiet, steady presence that supports both yourself and others, without force, without noise, without losing peace. And in that presence, something beautiful happens. Not everything needs to be said, because what matters most is already being felt. And as that quiet compassion becomes natural, something even more challenging begins to appear, because it is one thing to remain silent to avoid harm, and another thing entirely to remain silent when you are being seen in a way that is not true. When someone misunderstands you, something inside reacts almost instantly, a pull to correct, to explain, to set the record straight. That pull feels justified, almost necessary. Now something deeper must be faced. There is a discomfort that comes not from what is happening, but from how you are being perceived. A tension that rises when your intentions are not recognized, when your actions are interpreted incorrectly, when your silence itself is misunderstood. It feels like something important is at risk, as if your identity is being shaped by something outside of your control. And this is where the spiritual power begins to reveal itself. Letting others misunderstand you is not weakness. It is one of the most difficult forms of inner strength, because it goes directly against the need to protect your image. It challenges the idea that you must always be seen correctly to remain whole. It asks you to remain steady even when your reflection in someone else's mind is distorted. This is not easy, because from a very early point there is conditioning to be understood, to be seen as good, as right, as fair. There is a belief that if you are misunderstood, something is wrong, something needs to be fixed, and so the mind moves quickly to correct it. But what if that correction is not necessary? What if your truth does not depend on being accurately perceived? This is where something shifts. When you stop trying to control how others see you, you begin to see how little control was ever there in the first place. Every person sees through their own lens. Their experiences, their beliefs, their emotions all shape what they understand. So even if you explain perfectly, even if you speak clearly, their interpretation will still be influenced by what they bring into the moment. This means that being fully understood by everyone is not realistic, and holding on to that expectation creates tension, because it creates a constant need to adjust, to explain, to align your expression with how you want to be seen. It turns interaction into effort. It makes peace dependent on something unstable. But when you allow misunderstanding to exist, something different happens. The pressure drops. There is no longer a need to fix every perception, no longer a need to correct every assumption, no longer a need to defend every part of your identity, and in that absence of pressure there is relief, not because misunderstanding is pleasant, but because the need to control it is gone. This is where the spiritual aspect becomes clear. Because letting others misunderstand you requires detachment, detachment from image, detachment from validation, detachment from the need to be seen in a specific way. And this detachment creates freedom, freedom from the constant effort to maintain a certain perception, freedom from the emotional weight of being judged incorrectly, freedom from the cycle of explaining and re-explaining. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop depending. You stop depending on others to reflect your truth accurately. You stop depending on their understanding to feel secure. You stop depending on their agreement to feel at peace. And when that dependency fades, your center becomes more stable, because it is no longer tied to something outside of you. There is also something else that becomes visible. Misunderstanding often reveals more about the other person than it does about you. The way someone interprets your actions says more about their perspective than your intention. Their reaction is shaped by their internal world, their thoughts, their fears, their past experiences. And when this is seen, there is less urgency to correct them, because their misunderstanding is not something you created, it is something that arose within them. And while you can clarify if needed, you do not need to carry the responsibility of changing it. This creates space. Space to observe instead of react. Space to understand instead of defend. Space to remain grounded even when things are misrepresented. This grounding is powerful because it is not shaken by external perception. It does not fluctuate based on who understands and who does not. It remains steady. And that steadiness becomes a source of peace. But this kind of peace requires letting go of something deeply rooted, the need to have the last word, the need to close every loop, the need to make sure everything is clear. These needs feel strong because they promise resolution. They promise a sense of completion. But in reality, they often lead to more engagement, more explanation, more cycles of misunderstanding. Because not every loop can be closed through words. Some loops remain open, some misunderstandings remain unresolved, and that is part of life. Accepting this is not resignation, it is clarity. Clarity that not everything needs to be finished, that not everything needs to be corrected, that some things can remain as they are without disturbing your inner state. This acceptance brings a different kind of strength, a quiet confidence, one that does not need constant reinforcement, one that does not depend on external alignment, one that remains even when things are unclear. This confidence is not loud, it does not argue, it does not prove, it simply exists. And because of that, it is not easily shaken. There is also a subtle transformation that happens in relationships. When you stop reacting to misunderstanding, the dynamic changes. There is less tension, less back and forth, less need to defend positions. And over time, this can lead to deeper understanding, not through force, but through space. Because when there is no pressure, people sometimes begin to reflect. They begin to see things differently on their own, not because they were convinced, but because they were not pushed. And even if they do not change, your peace is not affected, because it is no longer tied to their perception. This is the essence of letting go. Not letting go of truth, but letting go of the need to control how truth is received. And this letting go creates a sense of lightness, a reduction in mental weight, a decrease in emotional strain, because there is less to manage, less to maintain, less to hold on to. This allows energy to return inward, to be used for awareness, for presence, for clarity, instead of being spent on external correction. And in that shift, life feels different, more spacious, less heavy, more aligned. This does not mean there will never be moments where clarification is needed. There are times when speaking is appropriate, when understanding is important, when silence would not serve the situation. But even in those moments, there is a difference. The intention is not to control perception, it is simply to express, without attachment to the outcome, without needing it to be received in a specific way. And because of that, the interaction remains lighter, less charged, less demanding. This is the balance that develops, knowing when to speak, knowing when to remain silent, knowing when to let things be, and trusting that your peace does not depend on constant correction. This trust is what allows misunderstanding to exist without creating disturbance. It is what allows you to remain centered even when things are unclear. It is what allows you to move through situations without being pulled into every interpretation. And in that movement, there is freedom. A freedom that is not affected by how others see you. A freedom that is not dependent on being understood. A freedom that comes from within. And once this is experienced, even briefly, something changes. The fear of misunderstanding begins to fade. The need to explain begins to soften. The urge to control perception begins to loosen. And what remains is something much simpler: presence, clarity, peace. A peace that does not need to be protected through words. A peace that is not disturbed by misinterpretation. A peace that remains even when others do not see you clearly. This is the spiritual power of letting others misunderstand you, not as a loss, but as a release from the constant effort to be seen in a certain way, a release from the pressure to correct every perception, a release from the need to manage how you exist in the minds of others. And in that release, there is space. Space to be as you are, without adjustment, without explanation, without fear. And in that space, there is a quiet strength, a strength that does not need to be proven, a strength that does not need to be recognized, a strength that simply remains, steady, unmoved, at peace. And as that quiet strength settles, something even more personal begins to surface. It is no longer about how others see you, or whether they understand you, or even whether they misunderstand you. It becomes something closer, something more subtle, something that happens inside in the very moment you choose to speak. Now something deeper must be faced. There are moments when words do not protect you. They slowly move you away from yourself. It does not happen loudly. It does not feel like a mistake in the beginning. It feels like doing the right thing. It feels like keeping the peace. It feels like being kind, being reasonable, being understanding. But underneath, something else is happening. Speaking can become a form of self-abandonment. This is not about all speaking. It is about the moments when words are used against your own truth. The moments when something inside you says no, but your mouth says yes. The moments when you soften what you feel just to avoid discomfort. The moments when you explain away your own boundaries so that others can remain comfortable. These moments are easy to miss because they look like cooperation. They look like maturity. They look like emotional intelligence. But when they are observed closely, there is a quiet cost. Each time you speak against what you feel, a small distance is created between you and yourself. It is not dramatic, it is subtle, but it accumulates. At first, it may feel like a simple adjustment, a small compromise to keep things smooth, a slight change in tone to avoid tension, a careful choice of words to prevent conflict. But over time, these small adjustments begin to shape how you relate to your own inner voice. You start listening to it less, trusting it less, following it less, and this is where self-abandonment begins to take root. It is not about losing yourself completely. It is about slowly moving away from your center. Each time you ignore what you feel in order to maintain harmony outside, you reinforce the idea that your inner truth is less important than external comfort. This creates a pattern where speaking becomes automatic but not aligned. Words come out, but they do not reflect what is actually inside. They reflect what is expected, what is safe, what will avoid reaction. And this disconnect creates tension, because even if everything appears calm on the surface, something inside knows that what was expressed was not fully true. This creates a kind of internal friction, a feeling that something is off, that something was left unsaid, or worse, that something was said that should not have been. This is the hidden weight of self-abandonment through speech. It does not always show up immediately, but it lingers. It appears later as discomfort, as overthinking, as a sense of being drained after interactions that seemed simple, because energy was used not just to communicate, but to override what was actually felt, and overriding inner truth takes effort. It requires adjustment. It requires control. It requires a constant monitoring of what is being said versus what is being felt, and this creates exhaustion. This is why some conversations feel heavier than others, not because of what was discussed, but because of how much was suppressed or altered in the process. When words are aligned with inner truth, there is ease. Even if the conversation is difficult, there is a sense of clarity. But when words are misaligned, even simple conversations can feel draining, because there is a split between expression and authenticity. This split is what silence can reveal, because when there is no speaking, there is no need to adjust, no need to perform, no need to shape words to fit expectations. There is only what is actually present, and in that presence it becomes easier to see where speaking has been used to move away from that truth. This awareness can be uncomfortable, because it shows how often speaking has been used not as a form of expression, but as a form of avoidance, avoiding conflict, avoiding discomfort, avoiding rejection, avoiding the possibility of being seen differently. And in avoiding these things, something important is sacrificed: the connection with your own inner state. This does not mean that every thought must be spoken. It does not mean that silence is always better. It means that speaking should not come at the cost of abandoning what is real inside. There is a difference between choosing not to speak and speaking against your own truth. One preserves alignment, the other breaks it, and this difference becomes clearer with awareness. There is a moment before speaking, a brief pause. In that pause, there is a choice: to speak from alignment or to speak from adjustment. When this pause is noticed, everything begins to change, because it creates space for honesty, Not necessarily honesty that is spoken, but honesty that is acknowledged internally. And once something is acknowledged internally, it becomes harder to ignore. This leads to a different kind of speaking, one that is slower, more intentional, more grounded. Words are no longer used to manage reactions. They are used to express what is actually present. And when speaking from this place, there is less need to explain, less need to justify, less need to defend, because the words are not trying to achieve something. They are simply reflecting something. This removes pressure, because the outcome is no longer the focus. The focus is alignment. And when alignment is present, the interaction becomes lighter, regardless of how it is received. There is also something else that begins to shift. The fear of discomfort starts to weaken, because when speaking is no longer used to avoid discomfort, discomfort becomes something that can be experienced without needing to escape it. This creates resilience, a kind of inner stability that does not depend on everything being smooth, because smoothness is no longer being forced. It is allowed to arise naturally when it does. And when it does not, there is still a sense of steadiness. This steadiness is important, because it allows for boundaries to exist without needing to be explained excessively. It allows for honesty without aggression. It allows for silence without guilt, and it allows for speaking without self-abandonment. This creates a different way of being in relationships, one where connection is not maintained through constant adjustment, but through authenticity. And authenticity does not mean saying everything. It means not saying things that are untrue to yourself. This is a subtle but important distinction, because self-abandonment often hides in the things that are said, not in what is left unsaid. It hides in the agreements that are made without true agreement, in the reassurances that are given without full sincerity, in the explanations that are offered not from clarity but from pressure. These are the moments where silence would have been more aligned, not as avoidance but as honesty, because sometimes not speaking is the most truthful response. Not because there is nothing to say, but because what is true is not ready to be expressed, or does not need to be expressed at all. This kind of silence protects the connection with yourself. It keeps you grounded in what is real. It prevents the drift that happens when words are used to disconnect from inner truth. And over time, this creates a stronger sense of self, one that is not easily influenced by external pressure, one that does not need to adjust constantly to fit different situations, one that remains consistent. This consistency is felt, not just internally, but by others as well, because when someone is aligned, there is a clarity in their presence, a steadiness that does not shift with every interaction. And this steadiness creates trust, not because everything is said perfectly, but because there is no hidden tension, no underlying conflict between what is felt and what is expressed. This is the opposite of self-abandonment. It is self-connection, a connection that is maintained even in difficult situations, even in moments where speaking would be easier, even in moments where silence would be misunderstood, because the priority is no longer external comfort. It is internal alignment, and when that becomes the priority, everything changes. Speaking becomes more honest, silence becomes more natural, and peace becomes more stable, because it is no longer dependent on constant adjustment. It is rooted in something deeper, the willingness to remain true to what is real inside, even when it is not convenient, even when it is not easy, even when it is not fully understood by others. And in that willingness there is strength, a quiet strength, one that does not need to prove itself, one that does not need to be seen, one that simply remains, grounded, clear, at peace. And as that inner alignment becomes stronger, something else begins to stand out with surprising clarity. It is no longer just about what you say or do, but about what you choose to step into. Because not every situation that appears in front of you deserves your presence, and not every emotional pull needs your participation. Now, something deeper must be seen. There are invitations that do not look like invitations. They do not arrive with politeness or clarity. They arrive as comments, as tone, as tension in the air. They arrive as someone else's frustration, someone else's misunderstanding, someone else's need to pull you into their emotional state. And almost instantly, there is a pull to respond, to engage, to step into the moment. This pull feels natural, it feels automatic, but it is not always necessary, because many of these moments are not neutral. They are invitations to suffer, an invitation to argue, an invitation to defend, an invitation to carry emotions that were never yours, an invitation to enter a state of mind that disturbs your peace. And most of the time, these invitations are accepted without awareness, not because you want to suffer, but because the reaction feels immediate. It feels like the right thing to do. It feels like engagement is required. But Buddhist wisdom offers a different perspective. Not every invitation must be accepted, and more importantly, not every emotional situation requires your participation. This is where something powerful begins. The moment you recognize that you have a choice not just in what you say, but in whether you engage at all. This choice is often overlooked, because reaction feels like the only option. But when awareness is present, another option becomes visible. Non-participation, not avoidance, not denial, but conscious disengagement from what does not serve your peace. This requires a shift in perception. Instead of seeing every situation as something you must respond to, you begin to see them as possibilities. Possibilities that you can step into or step away from. And once this becomes clear, the experience of life changes. Because you are no longer pulled into every emotional current. You are no longer carried by every wave. You begin to stand on steady ground, observing, choosing, deciding. There is a moment, often very brief, where this choice exists. Before the reaction, before the words, before the engagement. In that moment, something can be seen. Is this worth my energy? Is this necessary? Will this bring clarity, or will it create more disturbance? These questions do not need to be asked in words. They can be felt. And when they are felt, the answer often becomes clear. Many situations do not need to be entered. Many conversations do not need to be continued. Many emotional exchanges do not need to be joined. And when they are not, something important is preserved. Your energy. Because energy is limited, every moment of engagement uses it. Every reaction consumes it. And when energy is spent on unnecessary situations, there is less available for what truly matters. This creates a quiet exhaustion, one that builds over time. Because it is not just one situation, it is many small engagements, many small reactions, many small moments where attention is pulled away from stillness and into disturbance. But when non-participation becomes a practice, this begins to change. Energy is conserved, attention is no longer scattered, and the mind becomes more focused, more stable, more at ease. This does not mean becoming distant. It does not mean ignoring people. It means becoming selective. Understanding that not every situation deserves your involvement, that not every emotion needs to be shared, that not every conflict needs your presence. This selectivity is not rejection, it is clarity. Clarity about what aligns with your peace and what does not. And when this clarity is present, decisions become easier. There is less hesitation, less confusion, less internal conflict. Because the criteria is simple. Does this support peace or disturb it? And when something is seen clearly as a disturbance, the choice to step back becomes natural. This stepping back can take different forms. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is changing the subject. Sometimes it is physically leaving. Sometimes it is simply not reacting internally. Each of these is a form of non-participation. Each of these is a way of not accepting the invitation. And over time, this becomes a skill, a quiet art. The ability to recognize when something is pulling you into unnecessary suffering and the ability to remain outside of it. This skill develops through awareness, through noticing patterns, through seeing how certain interactions always lead to the same emotional state, through understanding that these patterns are not random, they are predictable, and because they are predictable, they can be avoided, not by controlling others, but by choosing not to engage in the same way. This creates a different experience, one where fewer situations escalate, one where fewer emotions linger, one where the mind is less affected by what happens around it. This is not because the world becomes quieter, it is because your participation becomes more intentional. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges. Suffering is often not in the situation itself, it is in the involvement with the situation, in the continuation of it, in the mental and emotional investment that follows. And when that investment is reduced, the suffering decreases. This does not mean that life becomes free of challenges. It means that challenges are experienced differently, with less attachment, with less reactivity, with more space. This space is important because it allows for perspective. When you are fully engaged in a situation, it is difficult to see clearly. Emotions are strong, thoughts are fast, and clarity is limited. But when there is distance, even a small amount, things become easier to understand. Not just what is happening, but why it is happening. And this understanding creates more thoughtful responses. Or sometimes the realization that no response is needed at all. This is where wisdom begins to replace impulse, where choice replaces habit, where peace becomes more stable, because it is no longer constantly disrupted. There is also compassion in this practice, not just for yourself, but for others. Because when you do not engage in unnecessary conflict, you are not adding to it, you are not feeding it, you are not continuing it. And this can change the direction of an interaction, sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually. But the absence of participation removes fuel, and without fuel, many situations lose their intensity. This does not mean that others will always understand your silence. They may interpret it in different ways, they may expect engagement, they may push for a response. But their expectation does not require your participation. And once this is understood, it becomes easier to remain steady, to not be pulled back into the loop, to not feel obligated to respond to every invitation. This is where inner freedom becomes real, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. The freedom to choose where your energy goes, the freedom to step away from what does not serve you, the freedom to remain at peace even when others are not. This freedom is quiet. It does not need to be announced. It does not need to be explained. It is simply practiced, moment by moment, choice by choice, and over time it becomes natural. The mind begins to recognize situations more quickly, to see the pattern before it fully unfolds, to feel the pull before it becomes strong. And in that early awareness, the choice to not engage becomes easier. Less effort is required. Less resistance is needed, because the understanding is already there. This is the essence of not attending every invitation to suffer. It is not about avoiding life. It is about engaging with life wisely, choosing where to invest your energy, choosing what to carry, choosing what to let pass. And in making these choices, something important happens. Peace is no longer something that needs to be protected constantly. It becomes something that is naturally maintained, because fewer disturbances are allowed to take root, fewer situations are allowed to grow, fewer moments are extended beyond their need. And in that simplicity, there is ease. A kind of ease that does not come from controlling the world, but from understanding your place within it. And once this understanding settles, even in a small way, everything begins to feel different. lighter, clearer, more stable, because you are no longer saying yes to everything. You are no longer stepping into every moment that calls you. You are choosing, quietly, consistently, and through that choice, you are protecting what matters most, your peace. And as that quiet discipline deepens, another pattern begins to loosen its grip. It is no longer just about choosing where to place your energy or which situations deserve your attention. Something more personal begins to come into focus. The way you protect yourself, the way you react when something touches your identity, the way you rise to defend what you believe you are. Now something deeper must be understood. There is a version of you that has been built over time, a version that reacts quickly, explains quickly, protects quickly. It steps forward the moment something feels like a threat, a comment, a tone, a look, a misunderstanding, anything that challenges how you see yourself or how you want to be seen. This is the defensive self. It is not wrong. It is not your enemy. It was created to protect, to keep you safe from rejection, from embarrassment, from loss of control. It learned to respond before fully understanding. It learned to speak before silence could be considered. It learned that defense is strength. But this version of you carries weight because it is always alert, always ready, always watching for what might need to be corrected, explained, or protected. And this constant readiness creates tension, a tension that is not always obvious, but always present. This is where silence begins to change everything. Because silence does something that reaction cannot. It removes the need for immediate defense. When there is no response, the defensive self has no role to play. It does not disappear instantly, but it begins to lose its purpose. Because defense requires engagement. It requires words. It requires action. And when those are not given, something starts to shift. At first, there is discomfort. The defensive self does not like being inactive. It feels exposed. It feels like something important is being left unprotected. There may be thoughts that say something should be said, that silence is dangerous, that not responding means losing control. But if this moment is allowed to pass without reacting, something becomes clear. Nothing is actually lost. The identity that felt threatened remains intact. The truth that felt challenged remains unchanged. The self that felt the need to defend is still there, but without the urgency. And in that realization, the grip of the defensive self begins to loosen. Because it starts to see that not every situation requires protection. Not every comment is a threat. Not every misunderstanding is damage. This is a quiet but powerful shift, because the defensive self is built on the idea that something must always be maintained. An image, a role, a version of yourself. But when silence is practiced, it becomes clear that these things do not need constant protection. They exist without effort, and in many cases, they are not as fragile as they seemed. This reduces the need to defend, not through force, but through understanding. Understanding that the self does not need to react to remain whole. That identity does not need to be reinforced in every moment. That presence does not need to be proven through words. As this understanding deepens, the defensive patterns begin to fade. There is less urgency to respond, less need to explain, less pressure to correct. And in the absence of these, something new begins to emerge. A quieter sense of self, one that does not react immediately, one that does not feel threatened easily, one that does not need to protect itself constantly. This is not weakness, it is stability, because when the defensive self is active, stability depends on external conditions, on how others behave, on what others say, on how situations unfold. But when the defensive self begins to dissolve, stability comes from within. It is no longer tied to what is happening outside. It remains steady regardless of circumstances. This creates a different experience of life, one where situations do not feel as intense, where interactions do not feel as personal, where words from others do not carry the same weight. Because there is less identification with what is being protected, there is also a deeper layer to this. The defensive self is closely tied to ego, not in a negative sense, but in a functional sense. The ego creates a sense of identity. It organizes experience, it helps navigate the world. But it also creates attachment. Attachment to being right, attachment to being seen a certain way, attachment to maintaining control. And these attachments fuel defense. When they are challenged, the ego responds. It moves quickly to restore balance, to correct, to protect, to re-establish what feels threatened. But when silence is introduced, this process is interrupted. The ego does not receive the usual response. It does not get to act in the way it is used to. And this creates a pause where something can be observed, the attachment itself, the need to defend, the fear behind it. And in that observation, something begins to dissolve. Because attachment cannot remain strong when it is seen clearly. It loses its automatic power. It becomes something that can be understood instead of something that must be acted on. This is where the defensive self begins to fade. Not because it is forced away, but because its foundation is no longer reinforced. Without constant reaction, the patterns weaken. Without constant defense, the need decreases. And over time, what once felt necessary begins to feel optional. This creates a new way of being, one where the self is not constantly protected, but naturally stable. One where identity is not defended, but simply lived. One where presence is not maintained through effort, but through stillness. This stillness has a different quality. It is not empty. It is full of awareness, full of clarity, full of quiet confidence. Because when there is no need to defend, there is nothing to prove. And when there is nothing to prove, there is no pressure. This removes a significant amount of mental activity, the constant monitoring of how you are perceived, the constant adjustment of how you respond, the constant anticipation of what might need to be defended. All of this begins to fade, and in its place there is space. Space to simply be, space to experience without reacting, space to remain present without needing to manage every detail. This is the deeper effect of silence. It does not just reduce external noise, it changes internal structure. It shifts how the self relates to experience. From defensive to receptive, from reactive to aware, from controlled to natural. This does not mean that boundaries disappear. It does not mean that everything is accepted without discernment. It means that boundaries are no longer enforced through defense. They are maintained through clarity. A clarity that does not need to argue, that does not need to prove, that simply knows. And because it knows, it does not need to react. This creates a different kind of strength. Not the strength of resistance, but the strength of non-dependence. A strength that is not built on defending identity, but on understanding that identity is not as fixed as it appears. That it can exist without constant reinforcement. That it can adapt without losing its essence. And this understanding removes fear. Fear of being seen incorrectly, fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood. Because these no longer threaten the core. They become surface-level events, temporary, passing, not something that needs to be engaged with deeply. And in this lightness, the defensive self continues to dissolve, not completely disappearing, but becoming less dominant, less active, less controlling. It becomes a tool instead of a default state, used when needed, but not present all the time. This is the balance, not eliminating defense entirely, but removing its constant presence, allowing it to rest, allowing it to step back, allowing silence to take its place. And in that silence, something profound happens. The self becomes less rigid, less defined by reaction, less shaped by external influence. It becomes more fluid, more open, more aligned with what is actually present. This alignment creates peace, not as something that needs to be maintained, but as something that naturally exists when there is no constant disturbance. And without the defensive self, disturbance decreases because there is less resistance, less opposition, less need to protect. This does not make you passive. It makes you aware. Aware of what truly matters, aware of what deserves attention, aware of what can be left alone. And this awareness guides action, not through impulse, but through understanding. And in that understanding, there is freedom. Freedom from constant reaction, freedom from constant defense, freedom from the pressure to maintain a certain identity, a freedom that allows you to move through life with less tension, less effort, less noise. And in that movement, there is a quiet presence, a presence that does not need to be protected, a presence that does not need to be explained, a presence that simply is, steady, clear, at peace. And as that defensive layer continues to soften, something even more uncomfortable begins to rise. It is no longer about reacting or not reacting, no longer about protecting or not protecting. It becomes something deeper, something that touches how you are seen by others, and more importantly, how you feel about being seen. Now something difficult must be faced. There is a quiet fear that lives beneath silence, a fear that if you do not respond, if you do not defend, if you do not assert yourself, you will appear weak, that others will think less of you, that your silence will be mistaken for inability, for lack of confidence, for surrender. This fear is strong because from an early point, strength has been associated with action, with speaking up, with standing your ground, with proving yourself. And anything that looks like withdrawal, anything that looks like softness, anything that looks like stillness is often interpreted as weakness. So when silence is chosen, there is tension, not just from others, but from within. A voice that says something should be done, that silence is not enough, that strength must be shown. But this is where a deeper understanding begins. Peace does not come from proving strength. It comes from no longer needing to prove it. And this requires courage, not the loud kind, not the kind that dominates or overpowers, but a quiet courage. The courage to be misunderstood, the courage to not respond, the courage to remain still when everything inside is asking to react. And most of all, the courage to appear weak in a world that values constant assertion. This is not easy, because appearance matters in social interaction. How you are seen affects how you are treated, and there is a natural desire to maintain a certain image, to be respected, to be taken seriously, to not be overlooked. But chasing that image creates pressure, because it requires constant effort, constant adjustment, constant awareness of how you are being perceived. And this effort takes energy. It creates tension. It keeps the mind active, always watching, always managing, always trying to maintain control. But when peace becomes the priority, something shifts. The need to maintain image begins to lose its importance, not completely, but enough to create space. Space to choose stillness over reaction, even when it may be misinterpreted. This is where courage becomes necessary, because choosing silence in those moments can feel like stepping into uncertainty. There is no immediate feedback, no confirmation, no reassurance, just stillness, and the possibility that others may not understand it. But this is also where strength begins to reveal itself in a different form. Because true strength is not always visible. It does not always announce itself. It does not always seek recognition. It exists quietly, steadily, without needing to be seen. This kind of strength does not depend on how others perceive it. It is not affected by misunderstanding. It is not weakened by silence. It remains. And because it remains, it creates stability. A stability that is not shaken by external judgment. A stability that does not require constant reinforcement. This is the kind of strength that peace is built on. Not reactive, not defensive, but grounded, present, unmoving. And to access this, something must be let go. The need to appear strong, because as long as strength is tied to appearance, it becomes fragile. It depends on how others respond. It depends on how situations unfold. It requires constant validation. But when strength is internal, it does not need to appear in any specific way. It can be silent, it can be still, it can be misunderstood, and still remain intact. This is where the idea of weakness begins to change. What looks like weakness from the outside is not always weakness on the inside. Silence can look like surrender, but internally it can be clarity. Non-reaction can look like passivity, but internally it can be control. Stillness can look like absence, but internally it can be presence. And this difference is important, because once it is understood, the fear of appearing weak begins to fade. Not completely, but enough to reduce its influence, enough to allow different choices to be made. Choices that are not based on appearance, but on alignment. This alignment becomes the guiding factor. Instead of asking how something will look, the focus shifts to how it feels internally. Does this action create peace? Does this response align with clarity? Does this silence preserve stability? And when the answers are clear, the choice becomes easier, even if it appears weak to others. This is where courage is needed, because the external feedback may not always match the internal truth. Others may expect a reaction. They may interpret silence as avoidance. They may assume lack of confidence. And this can create pressure to explain, to justify, to prove otherwise. But if that pressure is followed, the pattern returns. The need to manage perception takes over again, and peace becomes secondary. But if that pressure is allowed to pass, something changes. The need to be seen in a certain way loses its hold, and with it, the fear begins to dissolve. This does not happen instantly. It develops through experience. Each time silence is chosen over reaction and nothing is lost, the fear weakens. Each time stillness is maintained and stability remains, confidence grows. Each time non-response does not lead to harm, trust deepens. And over time, what once felt risky begins to feel natural. This creates a new baseline, one where peace is not sacrificed for appearance, one where alignment is not compromised for approval, one where strength is not defined by reaction, but by presence. This presence has a quiet impact, not always immediately visible, not always recognized, but steady, consistent, unaffected. And because it is consistent, it becomes reliable, not for others, but for yourself. A reliability that does not depend on external conditions. A reliability that remains even when things are unclear. This is where real confidence begins. Not in how you are seen, but in how you remain. And this confidence does not need to be displayed. It does not need to be proven. It does not need to be defended. It simply exists. And because it exists, it supports peace. It allows silence to remain without doubt. It allows stillness to exist without fear. It allows non-reaction to feel natural. This is the deeper meaning of courage in this context. Not courage to act, but courage to not act. Not courage to speak, but courage to remain silent. Not courage to assert, but courage to let go. And this courage is not loud. It does not seek attention. It does not draw focus. It is quiet, subtle, but deeply powerful, because it allows you to remain aligned even when the world around you is not. It allows you to maintain peace even when others are reacting. It allows you to move through situations without being pulled into them. And in doing so, it creates a different experience of life, one where less energy is spent on maintaining image, one where less effort is used to control perception, one where more space is available for awareness, for presence, for clarity. This space is where peace lives, not in constant action, not in constant defense, but in stillness, in simplicity, in the absence of unnecessary movement. And to remain in that space, there must be a willingness to be seen in ways that do not always reflect your inner truth. This is the cost. But it is also the freedom. Because when you no longer need to correct every perception, you are no longer bound by it. You are free to be as you are, without adjustment, without explanation, without performance. And in that freedom, there is a quiet strength, a strength that does not need recognition, a strength that does not depend on validation, a strength that remains regardless of how it appears. And once this is felt, even briefly, something changes. The fear of appearing weak begins to lose its power. The need to prove begins to fade. And what remains is something much simpler. Peace, not fragile, not dependent, but steady, protected, alive within silence. And as that quiet courage begins to feel more natural, something else starts to become visible, something that was always there, but rarely noticed. It is not loud, not dramatic, but it sits beneath many interactions, slowly draining energy over time. Now, something more personal must be seen. There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from work or from physical effort or from lack of sleep. It comes from constantly trying to be understood, from explaining what you meant, clarifying how you feel, correcting how you were perceived, over and over again. This tiredness builds quietly. It hides behind normal conversations. It blends into daily interactions. It feels like part of life. But when it is observed closely, it reveals something deeper. It is the exhaustion of always having to clarify your heart. This exhaustion does not come from speaking itself. It comes from the need behind the speaking, the need to make sure your intentions are seen correctly, the need to prevent misunderstanding, the need to align how you feel with how others perceive you. And this need creates effort, not just in the moment, but before and after. Before speaking, there is preparation, choosing words carefully, thinking about tone, considering how something might be received. During speaking, there is monitoring, watching reactions, adjusting explanations, adding more detail when something does not seem clear. After speaking, there is reflection, replaying the conversation, wondering if it was understood, thinking about what could have been said differently. This cycle repeats, and each repetition uses energy. It may not be obvious at first, but over time it accumulates. It creates a constant background activity in the mind, a sense that something is always being managed, always being adjusted, always being clarified. This is where the exhaustion comes from, not from the words themselves, but from the ongoing effort to maintain clarity in the eyes of others. There is also something else that makes this exhausting. It does not always work. No matter how clearly something is explained, it can still be misunderstood. No matter how carefully words are chosen, they can still be interpreted differently. And when this happens, the natural response is to try again, to explain more, to clarify further, to make sure it is understood this time. But this creates a loop where effort continues, but resolution does not always come. And this loop can feel endless, because there is always another angle, another way to explain, another attempt to align perception. But the truth is, complete alignment is not always possible, because understanding is not controlled by expression alone. It is shaped by the listener, their perspective, their experiences, their current state. And these factors are not in your control. This is where the exhaustion deepens, because energy is being spent on something that cannot be fully managed. There is an attempt to control how something is received, but reception is not something that can be controlled. And this creates tension, a tension between effort and outcome, between intention and interpretation, between what is meant and what is heard. This tension is subtle but constant, and over time it becomes draining. This is why silence can feel relieving, not because it avoids communication, but because it removes the need for constant clarification. It removes the pressure to make everything clear. It allows space for things to exist without being fully explained. This does not mean that communication stops. It means that the need to clarify everything softens. And when that need softens, something changes. There is less mental preparation, less monitoring, less reflection. The mind becomes quieter, more at ease, because it is no longer carrying the responsibility of being fully understood at all times. There is also a shift in expectation. Instead of expecting complete understanding, there is acceptance of partial understanding. An understanding that communication is not perfect, that it does not always result in clarity, and that this is part of human interaction. This acceptance reduces pressure, because the goal is no longer perfection, it is simply expression. And when expression is not tied to outcome, it becomes lighter. Less effort is needed, less adjustment is required, and because of that, less energy is used. This creates a different experience of communication, one that is not exhausting, one that does not require constant management, one that flows more naturally. There is also something important that begins to develop: trust. Not trust in others to always understand, but trust in yourself. Trust that your intention is clear within you. Trust that your truth does not need constant reinforcement. Trust that misunderstanding does not diminish what is real. This trust reduces the need to clarify, because when there is confidence in your own understanding, there is less dependence on external validation. There is less urgency to make sure others see things exactly as you do, and this creates freedom. Freedom from the constant effort to align perspectives, freedom from the pressure to explain everything, freedom from the cycle of overthinking conversations. This freedom is not about disengaging from communication. It is about engaging with less attachment, speaking when it is needed, remaining silent when it is not. Allowing space for things to settle without needing to control every detail. This balance reduces exhaustion, because energy is no longer spent unnecessarily. It is used more intentionally, more selectively, and this preserves mental clarity. It allows for deeper focus. It creates space for presence. This presence changes how interactions are experienced. Instead of being focused on how something is being received, attention remains on what is actually happening, on the moment itself, on the connection itself, without the added layer of constant adjustment. This makes interactions feel more genuine, more grounded, less forced, because there is no need to perform, no need to manage perception, no need to maintain constant clarity, just natural exchange. And when something is misunderstood, it is not immediately seen as a problem. It is simply part of the process, something that can be addressed if needed or left as it is. This reduces emotional strain, because misunderstanding is no longer seen as a threat. It becomes neutral. And when it is neutral, it does not create the same need for correction. This further reduces the cycle of clarification, which further reduces exhaustion. There is also a deeper realization that begins to form. Not everything needs to be explained to be valid. Not everything needs to be understood to be real. Your feelings, your intentions, your perspective exist regardless of whether they are fully seen by others. And when this is understood, something shifts. The need to externalize everything decreases. The need to translate every internal experience into words softens. And with that, the mind becomes quieter, less active, less occupied with managing communication. This quietness is not emptiness. It is space. Space where thoughts can settle, where clarity can deepen, where presence can expand. And in that space, there is rest. A kind of rest that is not dependent on silence outside, but on reduced activity inside. This is what removes the hidden exhaustion, not by eliminating communication, but by removing unnecessary effort within it, by letting go of the need to clarify everything, by allowing some things to remain as they are, unexplained, unresolved, but still complete. This does not weaken connection, it strengthens it, because connection is not built on perfect understanding. It is built on presence, on authenticity, on the willingness to be real without constant adjustment. And when that willingness is present, communication becomes more natural, less forced, less tiring, more aligned. This alignment creates ease, an ease that is felt not just in conversations, but in the mind itself, because there is less to manage, less to carry, less to hold on to. And in that lightness, peace becomes more stable, not because everything is understood, but because the need for everything to be understood has faded. And once that need fades, the cycle of exhaustion begins to end. What remains is something simpler, a quieter way of being, where words are used when needed, where silence is allowed when not, and where the heart no longer feels the need to explain itself constantly, just to exist as it is, at peace. And as that quiet ease begins to replace the need to constantly explain, something else starts to become visible. It is not just the exhaustion that fades, but the speed at which everything inside you used to move. Thoughts, feelings, reactions, all rising and turning into words before you even noticed they had formed. Now something deeper must be practiced. There is a moment, very small, almost invisible, between feeling something and expressing it. Most of the time, that moment is skipped. Emotion rises, and almost instantly it becomes words. A reaction is triggered, and it is expressed without pause. This happens so quickly that it feels natural, automatic, even necessary. But that speed carries a cost. Because when emotion turns into speech without space, there is no clarity, there is no understanding. There is only impulse moving outward, and impulse does not always reflect truth. It reflects the state of the moment. This is where silence becomes something more than stillness. It becomes a fast. Not a fast from food, but a fast from emotional impulse, a conscious pause where feeling is allowed to exist without being immediately expressed, a space where the energy of emotion is felt fully, but not acted on instantly. This creates a separation between what arises and what is done. At first, this feels uncomfortable because the mind is used to release, used to expressing quickly, used to turning feeling into action without delay. So when silence interrupts that pattern, there is tension. The emotion does not disappear. It stays. It moves. It demands attention. And without expression, it can feel stronger. But this is where something important begins to happen. When emotion is not released immediately, it begins to change. Not because it is being controlled, but because it is being observed. Observation alters the experience. It slows it down. It creates space around it, and in that space, the intensity begins to shift. What felt overwhelming begins to soften. What felt urgent begins to slow. What felt like something that needed to be acted on begins to feel like something that can be understood. This is the effect of fasting from impulse. It breaks the automatic link between feeling and reaction. It allows the mind to catch up with what is happening, and once the mind is present, the experience becomes clearer. There is an ability to see the emotion without being inside it, to feel it without being driven by it, to understand it without needing to express it immediately. This changes everything, because when emotion is not immediately turned into words, those words become more intentional, more aligned, more accurate. They are no longer just a reflection of the moment. They are shaped by awareness. And because of that, they carry less disturbance. This reduces conflict, not by avoiding situations, but by changing how they are approached. Because many conflicts do not arise from what is said, but from how quickly it is said, from reacting instead of responding, from expressing before understanding. When silence is introduced, this pattern is interrupted. There is time to feel, time to process, time to see what is actually happening. And often, what is seen is different from what was initially felt. The first emotion is not always the deepest one. Anger may sit on top of hurt. Frustration may sit on top of fear. Irritation may sit on top of exhaustion. When expression happens immediately, only the surface is communicated. But when silence is present, there is a chance to see beneath, to understand what is actually there. And this understanding creates a different kind of response, one that is not driven by impulse, but guided by clarity. This is the power of emotional fasting. It reveals what is hidden beneath immediate reaction. It allows for deeper awareness, and it reduces the noise that comes from constant expression. There is also a physical aspect to this. Emotion is not just mental, it is felt in the body. Tension, tightness, movement, changes in breathing. When emotion is expressed immediately, the body does not have time to process it fully. It is released outward, often leaving residual tension behind. But when silence is practiced, the body becomes part of the experience. The emotion is felt physically, allowed to move, allowed to rise and fall, and in doing so, it completes its cycle. This creates release, not through expression, but through awareness. And this release is deeper, because it does not depend on external action. It happens internally. This reduces the need to speak from emotion, because the emotion has already been processed. There is nothing left to release through words. This changes the quality of communication. Words become calmer, more measured, less reactive, because they are no longer carrying the weight of unprocessed emotion. This also changes the relationship with feeling itself. Emotion is no longer something that must be acted on. It becomes something that can be experienced, something that can be observed, something that can pass without leaving a mark. This reduces fear, because many people react quickly out of fear of what will happen if they do not. Fear that the emotion will grow, that it will become overwhelming, that it will not go away. But when emotional fasting is practiced, it becomes clear that emotion has its own rhythm. It rises, it peaks, it falls, and if it is not fed by reaction, it completes this cycle naturally. This creates trust, trust in the process of feeling, trust that not everything needs to be expressed, trust that silence does not trap emotion, it allows it to move more freely. This trust reduces urgency, and when urgency decreases, clarity increases. This clarity allows for better decisions, because decisions are no longer made in the middle of emotional intensity. They are made after the intensity has passed, from a place that is more stable, more grounded. This leads to fewer regrets, because actions are not taken impulsively. Words are not spoken in moments of imbalance, and this preserves relationships, because unnecessary harm is reduced, misunderstandings are fewer, and communication becomes more intentional. There is also a deeper spiritual aspect to this practice. Emotional impulse is often tied to identification, to seeing the emotion as who you are. When anger arises, it feels like you are angry. When sadness arises, it feels like you are sad. But when silence creates space, something becomes visible. The emotion is present, but it is not the whole of you. It is something moving through you, not something that defines you. This creates distance, not separation, but perspective. A perspective that allows you to experience emotion without becoming it. And in that perspective, there is freedom. Freedom from being controlled by what arises. Freedom from needing to act on every feeling. Freedom to remain steady even when emotion is present. This steadiness is important because it allows you to move through life with less disturbance, less reactivity, less internal conflict. It creates a baseline of calm, a foundation that is not easily shaken. And from that foundation, everything else becomes easier. Interactions, decisions, responses, all become more aligned, because they are not driven by impulse, They are guided by awareness. This is the essence of silence as a fast, not a denial of emotion, not a suppression of feeling, but a pause in reaction. A space where emotion can exist without immediately becoming action. And in that space, transformation happens. The mind becomes clearer. The body becomes more relaxed. The heart becomes lighter, because there is less accumulation, less residue, less unfinished emotional energy. This creates a different experience of life, one where emotions are not feared, not avoided, but understood. And because they are understood, they do not control behavior. They become part of the experience, not the driver of it. This changes how silence is seen. It is no longer just the absence of words. It becomes a practice, a discipline, a way of relating to what arises. And through this practice, something deeper develops. Patience, a patience that is not forced, but natural. A patience that allows things to unfold without rushing. A patience that trusts the process. And in that patience, there is peace. A peace that is not dependent on everything being calm, but on your ability to remain calm within what is happening. And once this is experienced, even briefly, it becomes clear. Not every feeling needs to be expressed. Not every impulse needs to be followed. Not every emotion needs to become words. Because when silence is present, emotion can be felt fully without creating disturbance. And in that, there is a quiet strength. A strength that does not react. A strength that does not rush. A strength that simply remains, aware, present, at peace. And as that discipline of pausing begins to settle into your life, something else quietly asks for attention. Not all silence feels the same. Some silence feels heavy, tight, almost suffocating. Other silence feels open, light, and deeply peaceful. From the outside, both look identical. Inside, they are completely different. Now something essential must be understood. There is a silence that comes from holding yourself back, and there is a silence that comes from being free. One is built on fear, the other is rooted in clarity. One creates tension, the other dissolves it, and without seeing the difference, silence can easily become another form of inner conflict. Suppressed silence happens when something inside you wants to be expressed, but it is pushed down, not out of awareness, but out of fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being judged, fear of losing connection. So instead of speaking, you stay quiet, but that quietness is not peaceful. It is filled with unspoken words, unfinished thoughts, and emotions that have not been allowed to move. This kind of silence is not stillness, it is pressure. It feels like something is being held inside, like a door that is being forced shut, while something behind it keeps pushing to come out. There is tension in the body, tightness in the chest, a sense of unease that lingers even after the moment has passed. Because what was not expressed does not disappear. It remains, and when it remains without being understood, it begins to build. It shows up later as frustration, as overthinking, as sudden reactions in unrelated situations, as a feeling of being misunderstood, even when nothing has been said. Because the silence was not chosen from clarity. It was chosen from avoidance. This is why suppressed silence can feel draining, because it requires constant effort to maintain. The mind keeps returning to what was not said, replaying the moment, imagining different outcomes, holding on to the energy that was never released. And this creates internal noise, even when the outside is quiet. This kind of silence does not protect peace. It hides disturbance, and hidden disturbance does not dissolve. It waits. It waits for another moment, another trigger, another opportunity to surface. And when it does, it often comes out stronger, because it has been building without being seen. This is where confusion can arise, because silence is often recommended as a way to remain calm, to avoid unnecessary conflict, to protect energy. But when silence is practiced without awareness, it can become suppression. It can become another way of avoiding what is actually happening inside. And avoidance does not create peace. It delays discomfort. Liberated silence is different. It does not come from fear. It comes from understanding. It is not about holding something back. It is about not needing to express it. This distinction is subtle but important. In suppressed silence, there is something that feels like it must be said, but is not. In liberated silence, there is nothing that needs to be said in that moment. Not because it is being avoided, but because it is already understood internally. There is no pressure, no tension, no internal argument, just stillness. This stillness is not forced. It is natural, because the need to speak has dissolved on its own. And when this happens, silence feels different. It feels light, open, unrestricted. There is no sense of holding back. There is no sense of missing something. There is simply the absence of unnecessary expression. This is why liberated silence brings peace, because it is aligned with what is actually present. It does not go against the internal state. It reflects it. And when there is alignment, there is no tension, no internal conflict, no leftover energy that needs to be processed. This creates a sense of completion, even without words. This is the key difference. Suppressed silence leaves something unfinished. Liberated silence is already complete. Understanding this requires awareness, because from the outside, both forms of silence look the same. But inside, the experience is completely different. One feels heavy, the other feels clear. One creates tension, the other dissolves it. So how can this difference be recognized? It begins with noticing the feeling inside when silence is chosen. Is there tension? Is there a sense of holding something back? Is there a mental loop replaying what was not said? If so, it is likely suppression. But if there is ease, if there is no urge to speak, if there is no lingering discomfort, then the silence is liberated. This awareness allows for adjustment, not forcing yourself to speak, but understanding what is happening internally. If silence feels heavy, it may mean that something needs to be acknowledged, not necessarily expressed outwardly, but seen clearly inside. Because often the issue is not that something was not said, but that it was not fully understood internally. When something is understood deeply, the need to express it decreases, because clarity replaces pressure. And when clarity is present, silence becomes natural. This is why inner work is important, because without understanding what is happening inside, silence can easily become suppression. It can become another layer of avoidance. But with awareness, silence becomes a reflection of clarity, a natural outcome of understanding. There is also a relationship between truth and silence in this context. In suppressed silence, truth is avoided. In liberated silence, truth is already present, not necessarily spoken, but fully recognized. And because it is recognized, it does not need to be expressed immediately. It can exist quietly, without pressure, without urgency. This quiet existence of truth creates stability, because it is not dependent on external acknowledgement. It is not waiting to be confirmed. It simply is. And when truth is held in this way, silence feels complete. There is no need to prove, no need to explain, no need to correct, because nothing is missing. This changes how communication happens. Words are no longer used to release pressure. They are used to express clarity. And because of that, they are more precise, more intentional, less frequent, but more meaningful. This reduces unnecessary conversation, reduces misunderstanding, reduces emotional noise, because words are no longer driven by internal tension. They arise from a place of stillness. This stillness is important because it allows for deeper listening, not just to others, but to yourself. When silence is liberated, there is more awareness of what is happening inside, more connection to feeling, more clarity in thought. And this connection creates alignment. alignment between what is felt and what is expressed. This alignment removes the need for suppression because there is nothing being avoided. Everything is seen, everything is understood, and from that understanding, silence becomes a choice. Not a reaction, not a defense, but a natural response to the moment. This creates freedom. Freedom from the need to speak, freedom from the need to hold back, freedom from the internal conflict between expression and silence, because both are now aligned with awareness. This freedom is subtle but powerful. It allows you to move through situations without being pulled into reaction, without being trapped in suppression, without being caught between speaking and staying silent. You simply respond based on clarity. Sometimes that response is silence, sometimes it is speech, but both come from the same place, understanding. And because of that, they do not disturb peace. This is the deeper purpose of distinguishing between suppressed and liberated silence, not to judge one or the other, but to understand their effects, to see how each one feels, to recognize what creates tension and what dissolves it, and through that recognition, to move toward what is more aligned, more natural, more peaceful. This is not something that needs to be perfected. It develops gradually, through observation, through experience, through noticing the difference again and again. And over time, the pattern becomes clear. Suppression feels heavy, liberation feels light. And with that clarity, the choice becomes easier. Silence is no longer something to force. It becomes something to trust, a reflection of inner understanding, a space where nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be removed. Everything is already as it is, and in that there is a quiet, steady, unshakable peace. And as that clarity between suppression and freedom becomes steady, another illusion begins to fall apart. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet it shapes so many interactions without being noticed. It lives inside the effort to explain, inside the need to clarify, inside the urge to be understood. Now something deeper must be seen. There is a quiet belief that sits beneath many words. A belief that if you explain well enough, speak clearly enough, choose the right tone, the right timing, the right words, you can shape how another person thinks. That you can guide their perception, influence their understanding, and bring their mind into alignment with yours. This belief feels natural because communication seems like control. If you say it right, they will get it. If you explain it better, they will understand. If you try one more time, they will finally see. But this belief carries a hidden weight because it assumes that another person's mind is something you can manage. And when this assumption is held, effort increases. You try harder, you adjust more, you explain again, you clarify deeper. And when it does not work, there is frustration, confusion, a feeling that something is missing. But what is actually missing is not better words. It is the understanding that you cannot control another mind. This is where silence begins to dissolve the illusion. Because when you stop trying to explain, when you stop trying to guide how others think, something becomes visible. Their mind continues as it is. Their thoughts remain shaped by their own perspective. Their understanding follows their own path. And in seeing this, something shifts. The effort to control begins to loosen, not because you decide to give up, but because you begin to see that control was never truly there. Every person experiences the world through their own lens, their history, their beliefs, their emotions, their current state. All of these shape how they interpret what is said. So even if your words are clear, their understanding may not match your intention. And this is not a failure of communication, it is the nature of perception. When this is understood, the need to control begins to fade, because it becomes clear that understanding is not something you can force. It is something that arises when conditions are right, and those conditions are not always in your hands. This reduces pressure, because the responsibility shifts. You are no longer responsible for how something is received. You are only responsible for what is expressed. And even that expression becomes lighter because it is no longer tied to a specific outcome. It is not aimed at controlling. It is simply sharing. And when sharing replaces controlling, silence becomes easier. Because there is no longer a need to fill every gap, no longer a need to guide every thought, no longer a need to adjust every perception. There is space. Space for others to think as they do, space for misunderstanding to exist, space for difference to remain. This space is important because it allows interaction without pressure, without the constant need to align, without the tension of trying to bring minds together. And in that space, something else becomes possible. Acceptance, not agreement, not approval, but acceptance of difference. Acceptance that others will think in ways you do not, that they will interpret things differently, that they will not always understand, and that this is not something that needs to be fixed. This acceptance reduces conflict, because conflict often arises from the attempt to change another's mind, from the need to correct, to convince, to bring alignment. But when that need is absent, the intensity decreases. There is less resistance, less opposition, less back and forth. Because there is no longer a goal of control, this does not mean that communication stops. It means that communication becomes more honest, more grounded, more open, without the hidden agenda of shaping the other person's thinking. This changes the quality of interaction. Because when there is no attempt to control, there is more listening, more presence, more openness to what is being said, even if it is different, even if it is not aligned. And this openness creates understanding, not forced understanding, but natural understanding, the kind that arises when there is no pressure. This is one of the paradoxes. Trying to control understanding often prevents it. Letting go of control allows it to emerge, but even when it does not, there is still peace. Because peace is no longer dependent on agreement. It is no longer tied to shared perspective. It exists independently. This independence is freeing because it removes the need to manage every interaction, to monitor every conversation, to adjust every word. The mind becomes quieter, less occupied with strategy, less focused on outcome, more present with what is. This presence changes how silence is experienced. It is no longer a gap that needs to be filled. It becomes a natural part of interaction, a space where nothing needs to be controlled, nothing needs to be directed, nothing needs to be achieved. Just being. This being is enough, because there is no longer a need to influence, no longer a need to shape, no longer a need to guide. This does not mean becoming passive. It means becoming aware of what is within your control and what is not. Your words are within your control. Your intention is within your control. Your presence is within your control. But another person's thoughts are not. Their interpretation is not. Their understanding is not. And once this boundary is clear, something shifts. Energy is no longer spent on what cannot be controlled. It is directed inward, toward awareness, toward clarity, toward presence. This creates stability, because attention is no longer scattered across external outcomes. It is grounded in internal understanding. And from that place, communication becomes simpler, less effortful, less strained, more direct, more authentic, because it is no longer trying to achieve something. It is simply expressing what is. And when expression is not tied to control, it becomes lighter, more fluid, more natural. There is also a deeper effect. When you stop trying to control how others think, you begin to see them more clearly, not as something to influence, but as they are, with their own patterns, their own perspectives, their own way of seeing. And this creates compassion. Not forced compassion, but natural understanding. understanding that their thoughts are shaped by their experience, just as yours are shaped by yours, and this reduces judgment, because there is no longer an expectation that they should think as you do. This creates ease in interaction, in perception, in response, because there is less resistance, less need to correct, less need to change. This ease supports peace, because peace is disturbed by resistance, by the attempt to make things different from what they are. But when things are allowed to be as they are, resistance decreases. And when resistance decreases, peace emerges. This is the deeper effect of silence. It removes the illusion of control. It reveals the limits of influence. It clarifies what is yours and what is not. And in that clarity, there is freedom. Freedom from the effort to control. Freedom from the frustration of failed attempts. Freedom from the pressure to align every mind you encounter. This freedom is quiet, but it is powerful, because it changes how you move through the world, with less force, less resistance, less need, and more presence, more acceptance, more peace. This does not mean that influence disappears. There are still moments where words matter, where communication shapes understanding. But the difference is in the intention, not to control, but to express and to allow others to receive in their own way, to understand in their own time, or not at all, and to remain at peace regardless. This is the end of the illusion, the realization that other minds are not yours to manage. That understanding is not yours to force. That perception is not yours to control. And in that realization, something softens, the need to push, the need to adjust, the need to try again and again. It all begins to fade, and what remains is something much simpler. Presence without pressure, expression without attachment, silence without discomfort. And in that simplicity, there is peace, a peace that does not depend on agreement, a peace that is not affected by misunderstanding, a peace that remains steady, because it is no longer tied to what cannot be controlled. It is rooted in what is always yours, awareness, clarity, stillness. And from that place, everything becomes lighter, less complicated, more real, more free. And in that freedom, silence becomes complete, not as absence, but as understanding, not as withdrawal, but as release. And in that release, there is a quiet, unshakable calm. And as that illusion of control begins to fall away, something even more subtle comes into view. It is not just about others anymore. It is about what is happening inside you, quietly, constantly, almost without being noticed. Even when the outside becomes still, something inside keeps talking. Now something deeper must be seen. There is a voice that follows you everywhere. It comments on what is happening, explains what you feel, judges what you do, predicts what will happen next. It turns every moment into a story, a continuous narration that gives shape to your experience. This narration feels normal. It feels like thinking. It feels like awareness. But most of the time, it is not awareness. It is interpretation. And this interpretation creates distance. Distance between what is happening and how it is experienced. Because instead of simply living a moment, the mind begins to describe it, label it, evaluate it. It creates a version of reality that sits on top of the actual experience. And over time, this version becomes more dominant than the experience itself. This is where disturbance begins, because the narration is not neutral. It carries judgment. It carries expectation. It carries comparison. It brings in the past. It projects into the future. And in doing so, it pulls attention away from what is actually here. This creates tension because there is a constant movement away from presence, a constant need to make sense of everything, to define it, to understand it, to explain it. But not everything needs to be explained. Not everything needs to be turned into a story. Some moments are complete as they are, without interpretation, without narration. And this is where the deepest peace begins to appear. When the need to narrate starts to fade. This does not mean that thinking stops completely. It means that thinking is no longer constant, no longer automatic, no longer attached to every moment. There is space between thoughts. There is silence between interpretations, and in that space, something else becomes visible, direct experience. What is actually happening, without the layer of explanation, the feeling of breathing, the sensation of being present, the simple awareness of existence. This awareness is different from narration. It does not describe. It does not judge. It does not create a story. It simply notices. And in noticing, there is no conflict. Because conflict often comes from interpretation, from how something is labeled, from what meaning is given to it. But when there is only awareness, without added meaning, there is no resistance. There is no need to change anything, no need to adjust, no need to make it different. This creates peace, not as something that is achieved, but as something that is uncovered when narration stops. There is also something important that becomes clear. Narration often creates identity. The mind builds a sense of self through stories. Who you are, what you have done, what you are going through, how you are perceived. All of this is shaped by internal dialogue. And this dialogue reinforces patterns. It repeats the same thoughts, the same descriptions, the same interpretations, until they feel like truth. But these are not always truth. They are constructions. They are ways of organizing experience. And when they are not questioned, they become limiting. They create a fixed sense of self, a version that must be maintained, protected, defended. This ties back to the defensive self, because when identity is built through narration, it becomes fragile. It depends on the continuation of the story, on the consistency of the narrative, and this creates pressure. Pressure to keep the story aligned, to correct anything that does not fit, to maintain coherence. But when narration begins to fade, something changes. Identity becomes less rigid, less fixed, less dependent on constant reinforcement. There is more openness, more flexibility, more space, because the self is no longer defined by a continuous stream of thoughts. It is experienced directly, moment by moment, without needing to be described. This reduces tension because there is less to maintain, less to protect, less to control, and with that, the mind becomes quieter, not empty, but calm, not inactive, but clear. This clarity allows for a different kind of presence, one that is not caught in thought, not pulled into stories, but grounded in what is happening now. This grounding creates stability, because it is not dependent on interpretation. It is based on direct experience, and direct experience does not create conflict. It simply is. There is also a reduction in overthinking, because overthinking is driven by narration, by the need to analyze, to understand, to solve. When narration slows, overthinking decreases, because there is less material to work with, less repetition, less looping. This frees up mental space, space that can be used for awareness, for presence, for stillness, and in that stillness there is peace. A peace that is not disturbed by constant thought, a peace that is not interrupted by interpretation, a peace that remains even when things are not fully understood. This is important, because the mind often seeks understanding as a way to feel safe. It tries to explain everything, to make everything clear, to reduce uncertainty. But this effort can create more disturbance, because not everything can be fully understood. Not everything can be explained, and trying to do so creates tension. But when narration is reduced, there is more comfort with not knowing, more acceptance of uncertainty, more ease in not having answers. This reduces mental pressure, because there is no longer a need to resolve everything. Things can remain open, unfinished, and still be at peace. There is also a deeper connection to reality, because without constant narration, perception becomes clearer, less filtered, less distorted. Things are seen more directly, without the overlay of judgment, without the weight of interpretation. This creates a sense of freshness, a sense of immediacy, because each moment is experienced as it is, not as it is described. This changes how life feels, more vivid, more real, more present, because attention is not divided between experience and explanation. It is fully in the experience. This is where silence becomes powerful again, not just silence in words, but silence in thought. A quiet mind that does not need to comment on everything, that does not need to narrate every moment. That allows experience to unfold without interference. This silence is not forced. It emerges naturally when the need to narrate decreases, when the mind no longer feels the need to explain everything. When awareness replaces interpretation, this does not mean losing intelligence. It means using it differently. Thinking becomes a tool, not a constant state, used when needed, set aside when not. This creates balance between thinking and being, between analysis and presence, between narration and silence, and in this balance, peace becomes stable, because it is not constantly disrupted by internal dialogue. It is supported by stillness. This stillness is not something that needs to be created. It is already there, beneath the noise, beneath the narration, beneath the constant movement of thought. And when the noise quiets, even slightly, this stillness becomes visible, clear, calm, unshaken. This is the deepest peace, not dependent on circumstances, not affected by what is happening outside, because it comes from within, from the absence of unnecessary narration, from the presence of direct awareness. And once this is experienced, something shifts. The need to constantly think begins to fade. The urge to explain everything softens. The habit of narrating every moment loosens. And what remains is something simpler, being, just being, without needing to describe it, without needing to understand it fully, without needing to turn it into a story. And in that simplicity, there is freedom. Freedom from constant mental activity, freedom from the pressure to make sense of everything, freedom to experience life as it is, without interference, without noise, without narration. And in that freedom, there is peace, a deep, steady, unshakable peace. That does not come from controlling the world, but from no longer needing to explain it. And in that quiet, everything becomes lighter, clearer, more real, and fully at rest. And as that inner narration begins to quiet, something else becomes easier to notice. The mind is no longer as crowded, the noise is no longer constant, and in that space, a different kind of awareness starts to grow. You begin to see not only your own thoughts and emotions, but also what is coming from others. Now, something deeper must be understood. Not every feeling inside you belongs to you. There are emotions that arise naturally from your own experience, and there are emotions that are picked up from the environment around you, from the tone of a conversation, from the energy of a room, from the words and moods of others. These borrowed emotions often feel real, immediate, and personal, but their source is not always within. This is where confusion begins, because when these emotions are not recognized as borrowed, they are treated as your own. They are analyzed, reacted to, expressed, and carried. And in doing so, they become part of your inner state, even though they were never yours to begin with. This creates disturbance, because you are carrying more than you need to, more tension, more stress, more emotional weight. And this accumulation can happen without awareness. A conversation leaves you feeling uneasy. A person's frustration lingers in your mind. A situation that was not directly yours begins to affect your mood. And without noticing, your inner space becomes filled with emotions that were never truly yours. This is where silence becomes protection. Not just protection from external noise, but protection from internal absorption. Because when you are silent, when you are not immediately reacting, not immediately engaging, there is space to observe what is happening, to notice what you are feeling, to see where it is coming from. And in that observation, something becomes clear. Not everything needs to be taken in. Not every emotion needs to be carried. Not every feeling needs to become part of your internal state. This awareness creates a boundary, not a rigid wall, but a subtle distinction between what is yours and what is not. This distinction is important, because without it, everything blends together. Your emotions, others' emotions, external energy, internal response, all mixed into one experience. And this creates confusion, because it becomes difficult to know what you are actually feeling. And when there is confusion, there is instability. But when silence is present, clarity increases. There is time to notice, to pause, to feel without immediately identifying. And this pause allows for separation, a separation that does not reject what is happening, but simply observes it. This changes how emotions are experienced. Instead of immediately becoming part of you, they are seen, felt, but not owned. This reduces intensity, because borrowed emotions often carry extra weight. They are not processed through your own understanding. They are absorbed quickly. And when they are not recognized, they can create unnecessary stress. But when they are seen as borrowed, their hold weakens. They pass more easily, because there is no attachment, no identification, just awareness. This is where silence acts as a filter. It slows down the process. It prevents immediate absorption. It allows for conscious recognition, and through that recognition, it protects your inner space. This protection is not about avoiding people. It is about maintaining clarity within interaction, being present without being overwhelmed, being aware without being consumed. And this requires a different way of relating to emotion. Instead of reacting to everything that is felt, there is observation. Instead of assuming ownership, there is inquiry. Where is this coming from? Is this mine? Or is this something I am picking up? These questions do not need to be answered immediately. They create space. And in that space, understanding begins to form. There is also a deeper layer to this. Empathy. Feeling what others feel can be a form of connection, but without awareness, empathy can turn into absorption. Instead of understanding another's experience, you begin to carry it, and this can become overwhelming, because you are not only dealing with your own emotions, but also with those of others. This is where silence becomes balance. It allows for empathy without absorption, understanding without carrying, connection without losing your center. Because when there is silence, there is space. And in that space, emotions can be felt without being taken on. This creates a different kind of presence, one that is open but not overwhelmed, sensitive but not reactive, connected but not consumed. This presence is stable because it is not dependent on the emotional state of others. It remains grounded, even when others are not. This is important, because without this stability, interactions can become draining. Every conversation becomes an emotional exchange. Every situation leaves an imprint. And over time, this creates fatigue, a kind of emotional exhaustion that is not always understood. Because it does not come from your own experience alone. It comes from what has been absorbed. But when silence is practiced, this changes. There is less absorption, less accumulation, less carrying. And because of that, there is more energy, more clarity, more peace. This does not mean becoming detached. It means becoming aware, aware of what is being felt, aware of what is being taken in, aware of what needs to be released. This awareness allows for choice. Not everything needs to be held. Not everything needs to be processed. Some things can simply pass. And when they pass, the inner space remains clear. This clarity supports presence, because attention is not divided. It is not pulled into every emotion that arises. It remains centered. And from that center, interaction becomes more balanced. There is listening without losing yourself. There is understanding without being overwhelmed. There is connection without confusion. This is the deeper effect of silence. It creates space not just for stillness, but for discernment. The ability to see clearly what is happening, to recognize what belongs to you and what does not, and to respond accordingly. This response is not reactive, it is intentional. Sometimes it is silence, sometimes it is speaking, but it is guided by clarity, not by impulse, not by absorption. This creates stability in relationships, because you are not constantly shifting based on others' emotions. You remain consistent, grounded, present, and this consistency creates trust, not just in others, but in yourself. Trust that you can remain steady, that you can engage without being overwhelmed, that you can care without carrying everything. This trust is freeing because it removes fear. Fear of being affected, fear of being drained, fear of losing yourself in interaction. And without that fear, presence becomes easier, more natural, more relaxed. This is where peace deepens, because peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is the presence of clarity. Clarity about what is yours, clarity about what is not, clarity about what needs attention and what does not. And when this clarity is present, silence becomes a powerful tool, not just for reducing noise, but for maintaining balance, for protecting energy, for preserving inner space. This protection is not rigid, it is fluid. It adjusts based on awareness. It allows for connection while maintaining boundaries. It allows for empathy without losing center. It allows for presence without absorption. And in that balance, there is peace. A peace that is not easily disturbed, because it is not dependent on external conditions. It is maintained through understanding, through awareness, through silence. And once this is experienced, even briefly, something changes. The need to react to every emotion decreases. The tendency to absorb everything softens. The inner space becomes clearer, lighter, more stable. And in that stability, there is freedom. Freedom to engage without being affected. Freedom to feel without being overwhelmed. Freedom to be present without losing yourself. And in that freedom, silence becomes more than absence. It becomes protection, a quiet, steady shield that allows you to move through the world with openness, without losing peace, without carrying what is not yours. And in that, there is a deep sense of ease, a calm that does not depend on who is around you or what is happening, but remains within, clear, untouched, at peace. Silence is no longer what you thought it was. It is not weakness, it is not avoidance, it is not emptiness. It is protection, it is clarity, it is the quiet power of not reacting when the world expects you to, the strength of not explaining when your peace is at stake, the wisdom of knowing that not every thought, not every feeling, not every situation deserves your voice. You have seen how words can drain you, how explanation can exhaust you, how trying to control perception can trap you, and you have seen something deeper. That peace was never found in saying more, it was found in needing less. Less reaction, less defense, less noise inside your own mind. When you stop attending every invitation to suffer, when you stop borrowing emotions that were never yours, when you stop narrating every moment of your life, something shifts. The weight begins to fall away. The mind becomes lighter. The heart becomes quieter. And in that quiet, something powerful appears. You return to yourself, not the version shaped by reactions, not the one chasing understanding, but the one that simply is, still, clear, untouched, at peace. If this message reached you, if something inside you felt lighter, write in the comments, "I choose silence." Let it be your reminder and your commitment. And if you want more teachings like this, more clarity, more peace, more inner strength, subscribe to the channel and stay close. Because the deeper you go into silence, the more unshakable you become.